They told him he was nothing, a mop and a bucket. That was his legacy now. But when Ethan Cole stopped in front of that whiteboard and saw what a billionaire got wrong, he did something no one in that room expected. He picked up the chalk. And what happened next? It didn't just silence the room. It shattered a woman's entire world. If you stay with me until the very end, I promise you, this story will stay with you long after it's over. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The mop handle had a crack running down its center that Ethan Cole had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. Every night he gripped it, his palm caught on that splintered edge, and every night he told himself he'd wrap it with duct tape tomorrow. Tomorrow never seemed to cooperate. Tomorrow was always busy being today, and today was always a disaster wearing yesterday's clothes. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday night in November, and the third-floor hallway of Whitmore Hall smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Ethan pushed his cart past the philosophy department's faculty offices, the wheels squeaking against linoleum in a rhythm he could have kept time to. Squeak drag. Squeak drag. The fluorescent lights above him buzzed with that particular frequency that made everything look 10 years older than it actually was, including Ethan himself. He was 32. He looked 41. He'd made peace with that. His phone buzzed in his back pocket and he fished it out with wet fingers. A text from Mrs. Huang, the retired schoolteacher who lived 2 doors down and watched Chloe on the nights Ethan worked. She's asleep. Breathing sounds okay tonight. Left the humidifier running. Ethan typed back a thumbs-up emoji, then stared at the screen for a few extra seconds. The lock screen photo was Chloe at a park last spring, sitting cross-legged on a picnic blanket with peanut butter on her chin and a look on her face like she'd just been told the funniest joke in human history. He couldn't remember what the joke had been. He remembered the peanut butter, though. She'd wiped it on his shirt sleeve and laughed until she hiccuped. He put the phone away and kept pushing. Blackstone University wasn't the kind of place that noticed its janitors. It was a private research institution 40 minutes outside of Boston, the kind of school that put Latin phrases on everything and charged tuition that could have funded a small country. The buildings were old brick and tall windows, and in the daytime, the campus looked like something out of a movie about privileged kids discovering themselves. At night, when the students cleared out and the hallways went dark, it looked like what it actually was. A collection of buildings that needed their floors mopped. Ethan had been cleaning those floors for almost 4 years. He knew which classrooms had the sticky residue near the podium where professors spilled their coffee. He knew which bathrooms had the faulty flush valves. He knew the pattern of the heating system, how the radiators in the east wing clicked on at 11:15, and the ones in the west wing didn't kick in until nearly midnight, which meant that for 45 minutes every night, the west wing was cold enough to see your own breath. He was in the west wing now. His breath came out in thin clouds as he mopped. There was a system to the work. Start at the top floor, work your way down. Hit the bathrooms first because those took the longest, and if you saved them for last, you'd rush and miss the grout. Then the hallways, then the classrooms, but only the ones on the schedule. They rotated on a weekly basis. Monday and Thursday was the science wing. Tuesday and Friday was the humanities building. Wednesday was Whitmore Hall, which housed the graduate research offices and the advanced mathematics department. Ethan didn't think about the mathematics department. He had trained himself not to think about it the way a person trains themselves not to look at an ex's social media. It was there. It existed. He cleaned around it. But tonight, the schedule was different. Bill Frazier, the other night shift custodian, had called out sick. Sick, meaning his girlfriend's birthday, which Bill had apparently forgotten about until 4 p.m., and Ethan had agreed to cover his section too. Bill's section included the 4th floor of Whitmore Hall. The 4th floor of Whitmore Hall was the advanced research wing. Ethan pushed his cart into the elevator and pressed the button. The doors closed with a reluctant groan. Something inside the machinery clanked twice, and the elevator began its slow, shuddering ascent. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He'd been awake since 5:30 that morning. Chloe had a doctor's appointment at 8. Dr. Patel, the pulmonologist at Children's Mercy, who'd been managing her asthma since she was 4. The appointment itself lasted 20 minutes. The wait beforehand lasted an hour and 15. Chloe had been restless and bored, swinging her legs from the exam table and asking Ethan questions he didn't have answers to. Why do we always wait so long? Because doctors are busy, sweetheart. Busier than you? Different kind of busy. Is it the kind of busy where you're actually doing stuff, or the kind of busy where you're just not here? That one had landed harder than she'd meant it to. Chloe was 8, and she was smart in the way that made parenting feel like being cross-examined by a very short attorney. She hadn't meant anything cruel by it. She was just observing. Ethan worked nights. That meant he slept during chunks of the day. That meant sometimes when she needed him, he was unconscious on the couch with a blanket over his face and an alarm set for 2:45 so he could pick her up from school. He told her he was sorry. She'd told him it was fine. Neither of them had been fully honest. The elevator doors opened. 4th floor. The hallway was dark except for the emergency exit signs casting red-orange halos against the walls. Ethan pulled his card out and started at the far end, working methodically. Mop, ring, mop, ring. His shoulders ached. His left knee, the one he'd twisted playing pickup basketball in college, another lifetime, made a clicking sound every time he shifted his weight. He was halfway down the corridor when he noticed the light. Room 412. The door was open about 6 inches, and a cold white glow spilled across the hallway floor like someone had left a projector running. Ethan slowed. He was supposed to clean 412 tonight. It was on Bill's schedule, but he didn't like walking into rooms where things were still on. Usually it meant someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to shut everything down, which meant Ethan would have to call campus security to report it, which meant 20 minutes of standing around while Gary, the security guard, ambled over and made conversation Ethan didn't want to have. He nudged the door open with his foot and looked inside. The room was empty. 24 seats arranged in a tiered lecture format, a podium at the front, and a massive whiteboard stretching the entire width of the wall. The projector wasn't on. The light was coming from 3 standing lamps that had been positioned around the whiteboard like stage lighting, illuminating its surface with surgical precision. The whiteboard was covered. Not just covered. Consumed. Every square inch had been filled with dense mathematical notation, formulas, proofs, derivations, symbolic logic, written in a hand that was both precise and aggressive. Black marker mostly, with red marker used for annotations and green for corrections. Whoever had written this had spent hours on it, maybe days. Ethan stood in the doorway and didn't move. There was a rule he'd built for himself when he took this job, a wall he'd constructed between who he was and who he had been. He didn't look at the equations. He didn't read the papers left on professors' desks. He didn't linger near the research posters pinned up in the hallways. He cleaned around mathematics the way you clean around furniture, acknowledging its presence without engaging with its purpose. But this whiteboard wasn't furniture. This whiteboard was a cathedral. He took 2 steps into the room before he even realized his feet were moving. The equation. And it was a single equation, sprawling and interconnected across the entire board, appeared to be an attempt at proving a conjecture in algebraic topology. Something related to homotopy groups, if Ethan was reading the notation correctly. Which he was. He was always reading the notation correctly. That was the problem. He set the mop against the wall. His eyes tracked left to right, top to bottom, following the logical chain of the argument. It was sophisticated work. Genuinely sophisticated. Whoever had written this understood the field at a level that went beyond textbook competence. The opening assumptions were elegant. The early derivations were clean. The middle section introduced a novel approach to a well-known bottleneck, in the proof that Ethan found, despite himself, genuinely impressive. And then, about 2/3 of the way across the board, he saw the problem. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of error that you could stare at for weeks without catching if you didn't know exactly where to look. A substitution in the 14th line of the central derivation that appeared valid on its surface, but relied on an assumption about commutative properties that didn't hold in the specific algebraic structure being used. It was like a bridge built on solid foundations with one invisible crack in a supporting beam. Everything above it looked fine. Everything above it was doomed. Ethan stood there for a long time. His hands were at his sides. His heart was doing something it hadn't done in years. It was racing. Not from fear, from recognition. From the particular specific ache of encountering a language you used to speak fluently and realizing your mouth still remembered every word. "You're not supposed to be in here," the voice came from behind him. Ethan turned around. A woman stood in the doorway. She was tall, 5'9", maybe 5'10", and she carried herself with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being the most important person in whatever room she entered. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a way that looked effortless, but probably wasn't. She wore a charcoal blazer over a black turtleneck, and her heels clicked against the floor as she walked in. She looked like she was in her early 30s, but her eyes were older than that, cold and calculating and accustomed to control. Behind her, 3 people trailed in, 2 men and a woman, all in their mid-20s, all carrying laptops and notebooks. Graduate students, research assistants. They looked at Ethan the way you look at a pigeon that's gotten into a restaurant. "I said you're not supposed to be in here," the woman repeated. The custodial staff was told this room is off limits after 9. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. She was right. There had been a memo. He'd been covering for Bill and hadn't checked Bill's exclusion list. "Sorry," he said. "I'm covering for someone tonight. Didn't see the note." He reached for his mop. The woman had already walked past him toward the whiteboard, pulling a marker from her blazer pocket. One of the graduate students, a thin guy with wire-frame glasses, was setting up a laptop on the podium. "Dr. Laurent, should I pull up the simulation results from Friday?" the thin guy asked. Laurent. Ethan's hand tightened on the mop handle. He knew the name. Everyone on campus knew the name. Vanessa Laurent wasn't just a professor. She was barely even a professor. She was a visiting research fellow who happened to also be the founder and CEO of Meridian Ventures, a technology investment firm valued at something north of $2 billion. She'd made her fortune identifying and funding breakthrough research in artificial intelligence and computational mathematics, and she'd done it before turning 30. Forbes had profiled her. Bloomberg had profiled her. The Wall Street Journal had run a feature calling her the most dangerous mind in venture capital, which she reportedly had framed and hung in her bathroom. She was at Blackstone on a 1-year fellowship, ostensibly to collaborate with the university's mathematics department on theoretical research. In practice, her presence was a publicity coup for the university, and everyone knew it. The administration gave her whatever she wanted: lab space, research assistants, schedule accommodations, a reserved parking spot that was closer to the building than the dean's. Ethan should have walked out. He was already turning toward the door when his eyes caught the whiteboard again, and the crack in the equation pulsed at him like a heartbeat. He stopped. Later, he would wonder what would have happened if he'd just kept walking. If he'd pushed his cart back into the hallway and finished his shift and gone home and fallen asleep on the couch while Chloe's humidifier hummed in the next room. He could have lived the rest of his life without saying anything. The crack in the equation wasn't his problem. Vanessa Laurent's research wasn't his responsibility. He was a janitor. He cleaned things. That was the deal he'd made with the universe, and the universe had mostly held up its end. But his mouth opened, and the words came out before his brain could stop them. "It doesn't work." The room went quiet. Vanessa turned from the whiteboard. The graduate students looked up from their laptops. The thin guy with the glasses actually pushed them up his nose, like he needed to see Ethan more clearly to understand what had just happened. "Excuse me?" Vanessa said. Ethan swallowed. His palms were sweating against the mop handle. "The proof. It breaks down in the 14th line of the central derivation. The substitution assumes commutativity in a non-abelian context. Everything after that point is built on a false premise." The silence lasted 3 full seconds. It felt like 30. Then Vanessa Laurent laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh that arrived in a courtroom right before someone got destroyed. Short, precise, and entirely without humor. "I'm sorry," she said, walking toward Ethan with her arms crossed. "Did you just critique my proof?" "I'm pointing out an error." "You're pointing out an error." She repeated the words like she was tasting something unpleasant. "In a proof that I've spent 4 months developing. A proof that's been reviewed by 3 of the leading topologists in the country." She gestured at the whiteboard. "This proof?" "Yes." "And you are?" "Nobody," Ethan said. "I'm the guy who mops the floors." One of the graduate students, the woman who had red hair and an expression like she was watching a car accident in slow motion, let out a small, strangled sound that might have been a laugh she was trying to suppress. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. She studied Ethan the way a cat studies something it hasn't decided whether to eat or ignore. Her gaze moved from his face to his janitor's uniform, the gray coveralls with the university crest on the chest, the name patch that said Cole in block letters, and then back to his face. "Fine," she said. She pulled the cap off a red marker and held it out to him. "Show me." Ethan looked at the marker. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at Vanessa. "I should get back to work," he said. "No, you made a claim. Now support it." Her voice had dropped into a register that probably terrified boardrooms. "Go ahead. If you think it's wrong, prove it." The 3 graduate students had stopped pretending to work. They were watching now with the expressions of people at a sporting event where someone in the stands had just challenged the athlete. Ethan set his mop against the wall again. He took the marker from Vanessa's hand. Their fingers didn't touch, but the distance was close enough that he caught a scent. Something expensive and faint, like the kind of perfume that didn't announce itself but lingered in your memory long after you'd left the room. He walked to the whiteboard. For a moment he just stood there. The equation spread out before him like a landscape. He could see the whole thing, the architecture of the argument, the way each piece connected to the next, the internal logic that held it together. And he could see the fault line running through it, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years living inside this particular mathematical language. He uncapped the marker and drew a circle around the 14th line. "Here," he said. "You're applying a substitution that treats this group as if the operation is commutative. But the structure you defined in lines 6 through 8 is explicitly non-abelian. The elements don't commute, which means this substitution," he tapped the circled expression, "doesn't preserve the relationship you need for the next step." He moved to the next section and drew a line connecting 2 expressions. "Because of that, this derivation here becomes invalid. And since the final third of the proof depends on the result from this section, everything downstream is compromised." He capped the marker and set it on the whiteboard tray. The room was very, very quiet. Vanessa hadn't moved. She was standing about 4 feet behind him, arms still crossed, head tilted slightly to one side. Her expression was unreadable. It was the kind of face that poker players spend years trying to develop. Total blankness, total control. "That's interesting," she said. "It's not interesting," Ethan said. "It's just wrong." Something flickered behind Vanessa's eyes. Something fast and hot, there and gone before anyone else in the room could have caught it. But Ethan caught it because he was looking directly at her, and because he'd spent enough years around brilliant people to recognize the exact moment when certainty begins to fracture. "Kevin," Vanessa said, without looking away from Ethan. "Call security." The thin guy with the glasses, Kevin, blinked. "Dr. Laurent?" "This man is in a restricted room after hours. Call campus security and have him escorted out." "I was just doing my job," Ethan said. "Your job is mopping floors, not vandalizing research." She looked at the red circles on the whiteboard with an expression of controlled fury. "Security! Now!" Kevin fumbled with his phone. The 2 other graduate students exchanged looks. The red-haired woman was staring at the whiteboard with her head tilted, her eyes tracing the same path Ethan had just outlined. Ethan picked up his mop. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. He'd broken his own rule, the wall between who he was and who he'd been. And this was what happened when you broke walls. You got cut on the edges. He pushed his cart out of room 412 and down the hallway toward the elevator. Behind him, he could hear Kevin on the phone with the security desk, his voice low and apologetic, like he was embarrassed to be making the call. The elevator doors opened. Ethan stepped inside. Just before they closed, he heard a sound from down the hall. It was faint, barely audible over the building's ventilation system. It was Vanessa Laurent's voice, and she was saying something to the graduate students. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was different now. The sharpness was gone. In its place was something he recognized from a long time ago, from a version of his life he'd spent 4 years trying to forget. It was doubt. Okay. Gary from security met him on the 2nd floor. Gary was a large man in his 50s with a mustache that had been impressive in 1994 and hadn't changed since. He looked uncomfortable. Ethan, man, I don't know what happened, but I gotta walk you out of this building tonight. Orders from the fourth floor. I know, Gary, it's fine. Did you do something? Like break something? I corrected someone's math. Gary stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. This campus, I swear. They walked together toward the service exit at the back of the building. The cold hit Ethan like a slap when they stepped outside. November in Massachusetts didn't play around. His coveralls were thin, and his jacket, a second-hand North Face he'd gotten at the Salvation Army 2 years ago, was in his locker on the first floor. You want me to grab your coat? Gary asked. I'll get it tomorrow. You sure? It's freezing. I'm sure. Thanks, Gary. Gary hovered for a moment, then nodded and went back inside. The door clicked shut behind him. Ethan stood in the parking lot alone. His breath plumed white in the darkness. Above him, on the fourth floor, he could see the glow from room 412's windows, the standing lamp still blazing. He pulled out his phone and checked the time, 12:23 a.m. He had 6 more hours on his shift, but he wasn't going back into Whitmore Hall tonight. He'd finish the other buildings on his route and deal with whatever consequences were coming in the morning. There were always consequences. That was another thing he'd learned in the years since everything had fallen apart. Consequences didn't wait for you to be ready. They just showed up, like bills in bad weather. He walked to the next building on his schedule, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the wind. The campus was empty and beautiful in the worst possible way, the kind of beauty that only existed when you couldn't afford to appreciate it. The old brick buildings glowed amber under the vintage lampposts. The pathways were lined with trees whose leaves had already fallen, their branches reaching overhead like the fingers of something reaching for something it couldn't quite grasp. Ethan didn't look up. He looked at his feet. He looked at the ground. He thought about Chloe. She'd had a bad week. 2 nights ago, she'd woken up at 3 a.m. wheezing, and Ethan had spent 40 minutes sitting on the bathroom floor with her, the shower running hot to fill the room with steam while he held her inhaler steady and counted her breaths. 18 per minute. 20. 22. When her breathing finally slowed, she'd leaned against his chest and said, "Dad, I hate this." And he'd said, "I know, baby, me too." And they'd sat there until the hot water ran out and the steam dissipated and the bathroom went cold. Her medication was costing him $1,100 a month. Insurance covered some of it. He had the bare minimum plan through the university's custodial contract. But the specialist visits, the nebulizer supplies, the emergency prescriptions when her rescue inhaler wasn't enough, all of that came out of pocket. He made $14.60 an hour. He worked 5 nights a week, sometimes 6 when he could pick up overtime. After rent, utilities, food, and Chloe's medical expenses, he had roughly nothing left. Less than nothing, actually, because the credit card he used for emergencies had a balance of $4,300 and a minimum payment he'd missed last month. He'd thought about asking his mother for help, but his mother lived in a retirement community in Florida on a fixed income, and the last time he'd called her, she'd spent 20 minutes complaining about the price of eggs. His father had been dead since Ethan was 19, heart attack on a Sunday morning while reading the newspaper, just like that. There one moment, gone the next. The newspaper was still open to the crossword puzzle when the paramedics arrived. 14 across, 6-letter word for sudden departure. Ethan had never actually looked up what 14 across had been. He'd invented that detail years ago, and it had lodged in his brain as truth. That was the thing about grief. It rewrote your memories until you couldn't tell the real ones from the stories you'd built to survive them. His wife, Sarah, had been dead for 5 years. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, progressed fast. She'd been 26. They'd been married for 3 years. Chloe was 3 when Sarah died, old enough to remember a warmth, a voice, a feeling of safety, but too young to assemble those fragments into anything she could hold on to. Ethan had tried to keep Sarah alive for Chloe through photographs and stories. There was a framed picture of Sarah on Chloe's nightstand. Sarah at the beach, laughing, her hair blowing sideways in the wind. Chloe called her Mom in the picture to distinguish her from the abstract concept of mom, which was bigger and harder and didn't fit inside a frame. Sometimes Chloe asked questions. Was Mom funny? Yes. Was she smart? Very. Was she like you? Better than me in every way that matters. That last part wasn't something Ethan said out loud. It was something he carried in the same place where he carried everything else that was too heavy to put down. In the space between his ribs, just left of center, where the weight pressed against his breathing all day and all night until he forgot it was there. He finished his shift at 6:30 a.m. The sun was just beginning to scratch the horizon, thin and pale, like it wasn't fully committed to the idea of morning. Ethan drove home in a 2009 Honda Civic that had 187,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been on so long he'd started to think of it as a feature rather than a warning. Mrs. Huang was asleep on the couch when he let himself into the apartment. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Chloe had a small coughing fit at 2 a.m., but went back to sleep. Rice pudding in the fridge. Ethan ate the rice pudding standing over the sink. It was good. Mrs. Huang's rice pudding was always good. He'd tried to pay her once for watching Chloe, and she'd looked at him like he'd suggested something obscene. "You're a good father," she'd said. "That's my payment." He'd tried to argue. She'd shut the door in his face. He'd left a bag of oranges on her doorstep the next morning as a compromise. He checked on Chloe. She was asleep in her bed, curled on her side with one arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit named Professor Beans, a name she'd given it at age 5 and refused to change on the grounds that he earned it. Her breathing was even. Her nebulizer sat on the nightstand next to the picture of Sarah and a half-finished math worksheet. Ethan leaned against the doorframe and watched her breathe for a long time. 16 breaths per minute. Normal. Perfect. He pulled the door most of the way closed and went to the living room. Mrs. Huang had already slipped out. She had a key and came and went like a benevolent ghost. Ethan sat down on the couch, still in his coveralls, and stared at the ceiling. The whiteboard was still in his head. The equation, the proof, the flaw. Vanessa Laurent's face when she understood what he was telling her, that flash of doubt that she'd buried so fast no one else would have seen it. He closed his eyes and tried to push it away. Mathematics was a room in his mind that he'd locked 4 years ago. He'd thrown the key into a river of grief and exhaustion and survival and told himself the room didn't exist anymore. But tonight, someone had jimmied the lock. He could feel the door swinging open, could feel the old air rushing out, could feel the familiar furniture of his former life sitting exactly where he'd left it, waiting for him. He'd been good at it. That was the worst part. Not just competent, not just adequate. He'd been exceptional. His doctoral advisor at Blackstone, Dr. Raymond Okoro, who'd since retired to upstate New York, had told him once, in a rare moment of unguarded honesty, that Ethan's intuition for abstract structures was unlike anything he'd encountered in 30 years of teaching. "You don't just solve problems," Dr. Okoro had said. "You see them, the whole shape. Most mathematicians work with pieces. You work with the whole picture." Ethan had been 26 when Dr. Okoro said that. He'd been in the 3rd year of his doctoral program. Sarah was still alive. Chloe was a toddler who liked to eat crayons. The future was a long, bright hallway full of open doors. Then Sarah got sick, and the doors started closing one by one until the hallway was dark. He tried to keep going. For 6 months after Sarah's diagnosis, he'd maintained his research while shuttling between the university and the oncology ward, writing proofs in hospital waiting rooms, attending seminars with vomit stains on his shirt from holding Sarah through chemotherapy. His committee had been understanding at first, then they'd been patient, then they'd been distant, and then, after Sarah died and Ethan stopped showing up to anything, they'd been silent. He'd withdrawn from the program officially 6 months after the funeral. No one had tried to talk him out of it. Maybe they would have if he'd asked for help. But Ethan hadn't asked for help, because asking for help required the kind of vulnerability that felt impossible when you were already bleeding from every direction. So he'd packed up his research, boxed his books, and taken the first job he could find that offered health insurance and flexible hours. Janitorial services at Blackstone University. The same hallways he'd once walked as a rising academic, now walked as the guy who cleaned up after the people who'd replaced him. The irony wasn't lost on him. It sat in his chest like a stone, smooth and cold, and he carried it the way he carried everything else, quietly. without complaint, because complaint required energy, and energy was a finite resource that belonged entirely to Chloe. He fell asleep on the couch. His alarm was set for 2:15 p.m. Chloe's school let out at 2:45. He dreamed about the whiteboard. In the dream, the equation wasn't wrong. It was alive. The symbols moved and rearranged themselves, breathing and pulsing like a living system, and Ethan stood in front of it with a marker in his hand, trying to keep up. Every time he wrote something down, the board absorbed it and produced something new, something more complex, something just beyond his understanding. He kept reaching, kept writing, kept pushing toward a solution that stayed one step ahead of him. And then Chloe was there, standing beside him, pulling at his sleeve. "Dad," she said, "the floor's dirty." He looked down. She was right. The floor was filthy, covered in chalk dust and eraser shavings, and he was standing in the middle of it in his janitor's coveralls with a mop in one hand and a marker in the other. "Which one do I use?" he asked her. She looked at him with Sarah's eyes, brown, deep, patient, and said, "Both." He woke up to his alarm at 2:15. The dream dissolved like sugar in hot water. He got up, splashed his face, changed out of his coveralls into jeans and a flannel shirt, and drove to Chloe's school. She was waiting on the front steps with her backpack and Professor Bean sticking out of the top zipper. She climbed into the back seat and buckled herself in. "How was school?" Ethan asked. "Fine." "What did you learn?" "That igneous rocks are formed from cooled magma, and that Tyler Bridwell picks his nose when he thinks nobody's looking, but everybody's always looking." "Both important lessons." "Dad?" "Yeah? Can we get pizza tonight?" Ethan did the math in his head. It was automatic, effortless, the same way the mathematical notation on the whiteboard had been automatic and effortless. His checking account had $312. Rent was due in 9 days, $1,100. Chloe's prescription refill was due in 4 days, $87 with insurance. The electric bill was overdue by 11 days, $94 plus a late fee he hadn't calculated yet. "Sure," he said. "We can get pizza." Chloe smiled in the rearview mirror, and for one moment, just one, the weight in Ethan's chest shifted slightly. Not gone. Never gone. Just lighter. They got a medium pepperoni from Sal's, the place on Carpenter Street that had been there since before Ethan was born. They ate it on the couch while watching a nature documentary about octopuses, and Chloe asked 14 questions about tentacle regeneration that Ethan mostly couldn't answer but enjoyed attempting. At 7:30, he helped her with her homework, math, which he could have done in his sleep, and a reading comprehension worksheet about a dog named Biscuit, who learned the meaning of friendship, which was harder. At 8:15, he gave her the nebulizer treatment. She sat on her bed with the mask over her face, breathing in the medicated mist while Professor Bean sat in her lap. The machine hummed its mechanical drone. Ethan sat beside her and read aloud from a book about a girl who discovered she could talk to whales. At 8:45, he tucked her in. "Dad? Yeah? Are you tired? A little? You look really tired." "Thanks, kiddo. That's very encouraging," she giggled. Then her face went serious in that way that 8-year-olds' faces go serious. Duh. Total commitment, zero subtlety. "I mean it. You should sleep more." "I sleep plenty. You sleep on the couch. The couch is comfortable." "It's not, though. The spring pokes you. I can hear you go, 'ow,' sometimes." Ethan laughed. It came from somewhere deep and genuine, a place he didn't access often enough. "You're right. The spring is a menace. I'll have a talk with it." She smiled. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I love you, Chloe Bird." "I love you too, Dad." He closed her door to a crack and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to her breathing settle into the slow rhythm of sleep. Then he went to the kitchen, opened the drawer next to the refrigerator, and pulled out the stack of envelopes he'd been avoiding. 3 medical bills. 1 past due notice for the electric company. A letter from his credit card company informing him that his minimum payment was overdue and his interest rate was being adjusted accordingly. And at the bottom of the stack, a letter from the university's Human Resources Department. He opened that one last. "Dear Mr. Cole, this letter is to inform you that effective immediately, your access to Whitmore Hall, 4th floor, is restricted to authorized custodial personnel during approved hours only. Any violation of this policy may result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. Regards, Office of Facilities Management. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he folded it, put it back in the envelope, and dropped it in the drawer with everything else. He sat down at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator in the corner made its intermittent ticking sound. Through the wall, he could hear Mrs. Huang's television. She watched Korean dramas at high volume because her hearing wasn't what it used to be. On the table in front of him was a small spiral notebook. It was cheap, 79 cents from the drugstore, and its cover was water-stained and bent at the corners. Inside, every page was filled with his handwriting. Not notes, not grocery lists, mathematics. He'd never stopped doing it. That was the secret he kept from himself, the lie underneath all the other lies about letting go and moving on and accepting the life he had. Every night, after Chloe was asleep and before he left for his shift, Ethan sat at this table and worked. Not on anything specific, not on any research agenda or publication timeline, just worked, exploring problems, following threads, tracing the shapes of ideas that came to him in the space between waking and sleeping, the liminal territory where his mind still operated at its full capacity. He opened the notebook to a fresh page and began to write. The pencil moved quickly, the symbols flowed, and for 30 minutes, Ethan Cole was not a janitor. He was not a widower. He was not a man drowning in debt and exhaustion and the slow erosion of everything he'd once been. He was a mathematician. He was himself. Then his phone alarm went off. 9:30 p.m., time to get ready for work. And the room went quiet again, and the notebook closed, and Ethan stood up and put on his coveralls and became the other version of himself, the version that survived. He drove to campus in the dark, parked in the employee lot behind the maintenance building, and clocked in at 10 o'clock. He did not go near Whitmore Hall, but somewhere on the 4th floor, in room 412, the lights were still on, and Vanessa Laurent was standing alone in front of the whiteboard, staring at the red circles the janitor had drawn around her life's work. She'd sent the graduate students home an hour ago. She'd told them she needed to think. What she actually needed was to be alone when the truth hit her, because Vanessa Laurent had spent her entire career being right, and the idea of being wrong, publicly, fundamentally, undeniably wrong, was not something she could process with an audience. She traced the 14th line with her finger. She followed the substitution. She checked the algebraic structure she'd defined in lines 6 through 8. Non-abelian. The elements didn't commute. The janitor was right. Vanessa pulled the cap off her marker, set it against the board, and then stopped. She didn't write anything. She just stood there, marker in hand, staring at the flaw she'd missed for 4 months. The flaw 3 leading topologists had missed. The flaw that a man in gray coveralls with a cracked mop handle had spotted in under 5 minutes. She put the cap back on the marker and sat down in the front row, alone in the cold white light, and for the first time in a very long time, Vanessa Laurent did not know what to do next. She didn't sleep that night. Vanessa sat in room 412 until nearly 3 a.m., working through the proof line by line with a legal pad balanced on her knee and 3 empty coffee cups from the faculty lounge arranged on the desk beside her like small ceramic witnesses. She checked the substitution 17 different ways. She tried alternate approaches to the 14th line. She attempted to rescue the proof by restructuring the algebraic framework entirely, and for 20 exhilarating minutes she thought she'd found a workaround, until that collapsed too, folding in on itself like a house of cards built on the same rotten foundation. The janitor hadn't just found an error. He'd found the error. The load-bearing wall. Everything she'd built for 4 months. Every late night, every collaboration with the topologists at MIT and Stanford, every presentation she'd given to the Blackstone faculty with that particular brand of confidence that made people either admire her or hate her, all of it rested on a single assumption that was wrong. She drove back to her penthouse apartment in Cambridge at 3:15 a.m. The city was empty and cold, and the Charles River was a black ribbon under the bridges. She parked in the underground garage, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and stood in her kitchen drinking water from a glass that cost more than most people's dinner plates. Her apartment was immaculate. 2,200 square feet of steel and glass and carefully curated minimalism. The kind of space that appeared in architecture magazines and made visitors feel simultaneously impressed and uncomfortable. Everything was in its place. The Eames chairs flanking the fireplace. The Rothko print, an original, not a reproduction, centered on the far wall. The bookshelves organized not by genre, but by the height of the spines, because Vanessa's interior designer had insisted that visual harmony mattered more than accessibility. Vanessa hated the apartment. She'd hated it for 2 years. But she'd paid $3.2 million for it, and admitting she hated it felt like admitting a mistake. And Vanessa Laurent did not admit mistakes. Except tonight, apparently. She set the glass down and opened her laptop at the kitchen island. The screen glowed blue in the dark apartment. She pulled up the Blackstone employee database. She had access to it through the Research Fellowship's administrative portal, a perk of being the university's most famous visiting scholar, and typed in a name. Cole. Ethan J. The record was sparse. Hired as custodial staff, night shift, October 2022. Emergency contact, Patricia Cole, Sarasota, Florida. Mother. Benefits. Basic health insurance. Dental. Waived. No disciplinary history. No commendations. No anything. But the employee database wasn't what Vanessa was looking for. She closed it and opened the university's academic archives instead. The doctoral program records. And there he was. Cole Ethan J., doctoral candidate, Department of Mathematics, 2018 to 2022. Advisor, Dr. Raymond Okoro. Research focus, algebraic topology, homotopy theory, abstract algebra. Status, withdrawn. There was a thesis proposal attached to the file. Vanessa opened it and read the abstract, and then she read it again, and then she sat very still for a long time. The proposal outlined a novel approach to a well-known open problem in homotopy theory. The same general territory as her own research, but attacking it from a direction she'd never considered. The mathematical framework was unconventional, aggressive even. It made leaps that most academics would have called reckless, except that every leap was supported by rigorous logic that held up under scrutiny. It was the work of someone who didn't just understand the rules, someone who saw past them. Vanessa read the proposal 3 times. By the 3rd reading, her hands were shaking, and she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from something else entirely. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The thing about Vanessa Laurent that nobody understood, not her business partners, not her board of directors, not the journalists who profiled her with words like brilliant and ruthless and self-made, was that she was terrified. Not of failure in the abstract, of a very specific kind of failure, the kind where someone better comes along and exposes everything she's built as ordinary. She'd been fighting that fear since she was 14, when she'd skipped 2 grades and entered MIT as the youngest student in her cohort. Her father, a Haitian immigrant who ran a dry cleaning business in Dorchester, had driven her to campus in his work van. He'd carried her suitcase to her dorm room and stood in the doorway, looking at the tiny bed and the bare desk and the window overlooking a parking lot, and he'd said, "This is the beginning, Vanessa, not the end." He'd died 3 years later, stroke. She'd been in the middle of her undergraduate thesis when the call came. She'd finished the thesis anyway, submitted it on time, received honors, because that was what you did. You kept going. You didn't let the world see you bleed. She'd built Meridian Ventures from nothing, a 23-year-old with a master's degree in applied mathematics and a $50,000 loan from her mother's retirement savings. Within 5 years, the firm was valued at $400 million. Within 8, it crossed $2 billion. Forbes put her on lists. Panels invited her to speak. Universities begged for her presence. And underneath all of it, every single day, was the fear. The whisper that said, "You're not as smart as they think you are. One day, someone will see through it." Tonight, in room 412, someone had. She poured herself a glass of wine, something expensive and French that she couldn't taste, and stood by the window looking out at the city lights reflecting off the river. Somewhere out there, in some small apartment she could probably buy 100 times over, a janitor was sleeping on a couch with a broken spring, and he understood her research better than she did. The thought made her furious. And underneath the fury, in a place she would never have admitted existed, It made her curious. The next morning, she made a phone call. "Kevin," she said before he'd even finished saying hello, "I need you to pull everything on Ethan Cole, not the employee file, the academic one, every paper he drafted, every seminar he attended, every committee he served on, and find me Raymond Okoro's contact information." "Dr. Laurent, is this about last night? Because campus security filed a report and facilities management already sent him a warning letter. I don't think we need to—" "I didn't ask for your analysis, Kevin. I asked for information." Kevin went quiet. Then, "Yes, Dr. Laurent." She hung up and drank her coffee standing at the kitchen island, still in the clothes she'd worn the night before, still running the 14th line through her head like a song she couldn't stop humming. By noon, she had a folder on her desk containing everything the university had on Ethan Cole's academic career. It wasn't much. He'd only been in the doctoral program for 4 years before withdrawing, but what was there was enough. 2 published papers, both co-authored with Dr. Okoro, both in respected journals. A conference presentation at the American Mathematical Society's annual meeting that had, according to the session notes, generated significant discussion among attendees. A letter of recommendation from Okoro that used the phrase generational talent without apparent irony. And the thesis proposal. That damn thesis proposal that kept gnawing at her. She also had Dr. Okoro's phone number, which she called at 12:30 p.m. Raymond Okoro was 71 years old, retired, and living in a farmhouse near Ithaca, New York, where he spent his days tending to a vegetable garden and writing a book about the history of topology that he suspected no one would ever read. He answered Vanessa's call on the 4th ring. "Dr. Okoro, this is Vanessa Laurent. I'm a research fellow at Blackstone University." "I know who you are, Ms. Laurent. You gave a talk at the Field Symposium last year that I watched online. Interesting work. Ambitious." "Thank you. I'm calling about a former student of yours, Ethan Cole." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a long one, but loaded. The kind of pause that contained entire conversations. "What about Ethan?" Okoro said, and his voice had shifted, warmer but guarded, like a man protecting something fragile. "He's working as a janitor at Blackstone. Night shift. He walked into my research room last night and identified a fundamental error in a proof I've spent 4 months developing." Another pause. Then Okoro laughed. It was a rich, rolling sound, full of affection and something that might have been grief. "Of course he did." "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not. Ethan Cole has one of the finest mathematical minds I've ever encountered, and I've been doing this for 40 years. I supervised 3 Fields Medal winners. None of them had Ethan's raw intuition." Vanessa let that settle. "Then why is he mopping floors?" "Because his wife died, Ms. Laurent. Because he had a 3-year-old daughter and no money and no family support, and a grief so enormous that it swallowed everything. Because the university's support systems failed him completely, and because this profession, our profession, has a very specific way of dealing with people who stumble. We look away." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Vanessa felt each one of them. "Did you try to help him?" she asked. "I tried. For 6 months after Sarah's death, I called him every week. I offered extensions, reduced course loads, alternative arrangements for his committee. He wouldn't take any of it. He was drowning, and he was too proud to admit it, and I was too old and too far away to pull him out." Okoro's voice roughened. "Losing Ethan was my greatest failure as a mentor. I think about it more than I'd like to." "His thesis proposal," Vanessa said, "the approach he outlined, the non-commutative framework for the homotopy conjecture, is brilliant, was brilliant, would still be brilliant if someone finished it. Why didn't he? Because he chose his daughter, and I won't pretend I wouldn't have done the same." Vanessa thanked him and ended the call. She sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the folder of papers and the thesis proposal and the conference notes, and she felt something shifting inside her chest that she didn't have a name for. It wasn't pity. Vanessa didn't do pity. It was something sharper and more uncomfortable, the recognition that she was looking at a mirror, and the reflection showed someone who'd had everything she had, minus the one thing that would have broken her too. 2 days later, she sent Ethan a message through the university's internal email system. The subject line read, "Meeting request. Private." The body of the email was 3 sentences, Mr. Cole, I owe you a conversation, not an apology, a conversation. My office, Friday, 4 p.m., Whitmore Hall, Suite 401. She didn't expect him to come. Men with pride like that, the quiet, load-bearing kind, didn't typically accept invitations from the people who'd embarrassed them. She'd had him escorted out by security for the sake of her own ego. She'd treated his intelligence as an insult. If their positions were reversed, Vanessa would have deleted the email and gone back to mopping. But Ethan Cole wasn't Vanessa Laurent. He showed up at 4:07 p.m. on Friday, wearing a clean flannel shirt and jeans that had been ironed, which Vanessa noticed, and Ethan would have been mortified to know she noticed. He stood in the doorway of her office, the corner suite on the 4th floor, all windows and white furniture and a view of the campus quad, and he didn't sit down. "I'm here," he said. "What do you want?" Vanessa was behind her desk. She'd changed outfits 3 times that morning, which annoyed her because she never changed outfits 3 times. She'd settled on something deliberately understated. A navy sweater, no jewelry except a watch. She wanted him to take her seriously, and she understood, in a way that surprised her, that the blazer and heels version of herself would have made that impossible. "Sit down," she said. "I'd rather stand." "Fine. Stand." She opened a drawer and pulled out a legal pad. "I reviewed my proof after you left the other night. You were right. The substitution in the 14th line is invalid. The entire 3rd section collapses." Ethan said nothing. His expression didn't change. He just stood there in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. "I also reviewed your doctoral work," Vanessa continued. "Your thesis proposal, your published papers, your conference presentations." She paused. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "You didn't ask. You called security." The words weren't accusatory. They were factual, which somehow made them worse. "You're right," Vanessa said. "I did." "Is that the conversation?" "No." She stood up from the desk and walked to a small table near the window where she'd arranged a set of papers. "I want to test something. I've prepared 3 problems: theoretical, advanced, relevant to my current research area. I'd like you to look at them." Ethan stared at her. "You want to quiz me?" "I want to understand what I'm dealing with." "I'm not a specimen." "I know you're not, but I am asking." He should have walked out. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of pride against curiosity, of self-preservation against the pull of the thing he'd been denying himself for 4 years. She watched him fight with it, and she kept her mouth shut, because Vanessa understood leverage, and she understood that the smartest thing she could do in this moment was nothing. Ethan walked to the table. He picked up the first problem and read it. Then he sat down, finally, and pulled a pen from his shirt pocket. "Do you have scrap paper?" he asked. "Use whatever you want." He didn't use the legal pad she offered. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a hospital billing statement, Vanessa realized, with Chloe's name at the top and a balance of $2,347 printed in red. He flipped it over to the blank side and began writing. The first problem took him 11 minutes. The second took 8. The third, the hardest, the one Vanessa had designed as a trap, a problem with multiple valid approaches, but only one elegant solution, took him 14 minutes, and he found the elegant path. Vanessa watched him work. She watched the way his hand moved, fast and certain, the pen barely lifting from the paper. She watched his eyes, how they narrowed when he hit a complexity, widened when he saw through it, settled into a calm focus that was almost meditative. She'd seen brilliant people work before. She'd funded dozens of research teams, sat in on hundreds of seminars, reviewed thousands of papers. She knew what talent looked like. This wasn't talent. This was something else, something rarer and more unsettling. Ethan Cole didn't just solve problems, he inhabited them. He moved through mathematical structures the way most people move through physical space, instinctively, naturally, without apparent effort. When he finished the third problem, he set the pen down and slid the hospital bill across the table toward her. The billing side faced up, the red balance visible. Whether that was intentional or not, Vanessa couldn't tell. "Satisfied?" he said. "No," she said. "I'm terrified." That startled him. She could see it, a crack in the careful blankness, a flicker of surprise. "You're the real thing," she said quietly. "And you've been mopping my floors. Not your floors, the university's floors." "Ethan, we're not on a first-name basis." She accepted that. "Mr. Cole, I'm not going to pretend I understand what the last 4 years have been like for you. I'm not going to offer you sympathy or try to make myself feel better by being generous, but I am going to tell you something that you already know and that the world should have told you a long time ago. You're wasting yourself." "I'm surviving," Ethan said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "My daughter needs medication that costs $1,100 a month. My rent is due in 5 days. I have a stack of bills in a kitchen drawer that I can't open without my chest tightening. So yes, there's a difference. Wasting myself is a luxury I can't afford." Vanessa looked at him for a long time. The late afternoon light from the windows fell across the table between them, illuminating the hospital bill and the 3 solved problems, and the space where 2 people from very different versions of the same world sat across from each other and tried to figure out what came next. "What if you could afford it?" she said. "I can't." "What if someone made it possible?" Ethan stood up, his chair scraped against the floor. "I'm not a charity case, Dr. Laurent. I didn't come here to be rescued. I'm not trying to rescue you. I'm trying to recruit you." "For what?" "For the work you should have been doing all along." He looked at her, really looked. Not the guarded glance he'd been giving her since he walked in, but a real sustained examination, the kind that saw past surfaces. And whatever he found there wasn't enough, or wasn't the right thing, because he shook his head. "Thank you for your time," he said. He turned toward the door. "The problems you solved tonight," Vanessa said, and her voice was different now. Not commanding, not strategic, just honest in a way that felt unfamiliar in her own mouth. "The third one, the approach you used. I've been working on a variant of that same problem for 6 weeks. I couldn't find the path. You found it in 14 minutes on the back of your daughter's hospital bill." Ethan stopped. He didn't turn around. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and Vanessa could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigidity of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. "That doesn't change anything," he said. "It changes everything. Not for me. Not tonight. Tonight I go home and give my daughter her nebulizer treatment and read her a chapter of a book about a girl who talks to whales, and then I come back here and mop floors until 6 in the morning. That's my life, Dr. Laurent. That's what everything looks like from where I'm standing." He left. His footsteps echoed down the hallway. Not rushing, not angry, just steady and measured, the walk of a man who had learned a long time ago that the only direction that mattered was forward. Vanessa stood alone in her office. The hospital bill was still on the table, the red balance glowing under the overhead lights. She picked it up and read it. Children's Mercy Hospital. Patient. Chloe M. Cole. Diagnosis. Persistent moderate asthma, acute exacerbation. Services rendered. Emergency department visit. Nebulizer therapy. Chest x-ray. Follow-up pulmonology consultation. Amount due, $2,347. Payment status? Past due. 60 days. Vanessa folded the paper and put it in her desk drawer. Then she sat down and opened her laptop and began writing an email to the Blackstone University Board of Trustees. The email was never sent. She deleted it 4 times, rewrote it 3, and finally closed the laptop in frustration. The problem wasn't what to say. The problem was that saying anything required admitting something Vanessa had spent her entire career avoiding. She needed help. Not the kind of help you could buy or delegate or outsource to a team of analysts. The kind of help that only came from someone who understood something you didn't. The kind that required vulnerability. The kind that terrified her. She picked up her phone and called Kevin. "I need you to find out Ethan Cole's work schedule for the next 2 weeks," she said. "And I need you to keep this between us." "Dr. Laurent, I feel like I should mention that HR might have concerns about..." "Kevin." "Yes, Dr. Laurent." She hung up. The campus was going dark outside her windows, the lampposts flickering on one by one across the quad like a slow-motion constellation. Somewhere below, probably just now clocking in for his shift, Ethan Cole was putting on his coveralls and picking up a mop with a cracked handle that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. Vanessa looked at the 3 solved problems on the table. The handwriting was cramped and fast, the notation dense, the logic flawless. On the back of the 3rd page, the hospital bill, she could see where the pen had pressed hard enough to leave impressions on the billing side. Mathematical symbols ghosting over dollar amounts, equations overlapping with insurance codes. 2 languages. 2 lives. Written on the same piece of paper. She didn't know yet what she was going to do. She didn't know that the faculty senate was already meeting behind closed doors about the incident in room 412. She didn't know that 3 professors had filed formal complaints about unauthorized personnel accessing restricted academic spaces. She didn't know that the word janitor was already traveling through the department like a joke, the janitor who thought he was smarter than the billionaire. And she didn't know that in 6 days, that joke would cost Ethan Cole his job. But sitting alone in her office with the lights off and the city glowing faintly through the glass, Vanessa Laurent knew one thing with absolute certainty. The same way she'd known at 23 that Meridian Ventures would succeed. The same way she'd known at 14 that she belonged at M1T, even though every other student was older and richer and more prepared. She knew that she had just met someone extraordinary, and she knew that she had treated him exactly the way the world always treated extraordinary people who didn't look the part. She picked up the pen Ethan had left on the table. It was a cheap ballpoint, the kind you got in a 10-pack at the drugstore. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the plastic, the chewed cap, the faint warmth of someone else's grip still lingering. She put it in her desk drawer next to the hospital bill and closed it. The call came on a Wednesday. Ethan was in the school pickup line, the Civic idling rough in the queue of minivans and SUVs, when his phone rang. The number belonged to Blackstone's facilities management office. He recognized it because he'd called it twice last month. Once about a broken floor buffer, and once about a payroll discrepancy that had shorted him $14. Ethan, it's Dan. Dan Kowalski, the night shift supervisor. A decent man in his 50s who wore the same khaki pants every day and kept a photo of his Labrador taped to his clipboard. Listen, I need you to come in early today, before your shift. Can you be here by 7? What's going on? Just come in. HR wants to talk. HR about what? Dan paused. The kind of pause that people use when they know the answer, but don't want to be the one delivering it. Just come in, Ethan, okay? Chloe appeared at the car door, backpack over one shoulder, Professor Beans wedged under her arm. She climbed in and buckled herself without being asked. She'd been doing that since she was 6, one of those small independences that made Ethan simultaneously proud and sad. Who was that? She asked. Work. You look worried. I'm not worried. Your forehead does the thing when you're worried. The lines get deep. My forehead does not do a thing. It definitely does a thing, Dad. He drove her home. Mrs. Huang was already waiting in the apartment, watching a cooking show with the volume turned up. Ethan changed into a clean shirt, told Chloe he had to go in early, and kissed the top of her head. She was already doing her homework at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth the way it always did when she concentrated. He drove to campus with the heat on full blast because the driver's side window had a seal problem that let cold air whistle through. The sun was already going down, the sky turning that particular shade of bruised purple that November in Massachusetts specialized in. The facilities management office was on the ground floor of the maintenance building, a cinderblock room with fluorescent lighting and a water-stained ceiling tile that had been water-stained for as long as Ethan had worked there. Dan was waiting outside the door. He didn't make eye contact. They're inside, Dan said. Listen, Ethan, whatever happens in there, I want you to know this wasn't my call. Dan, what's going on? Just go in. The room held 3 people. A woman from HR named Linda Price, whom Ethan had met exactly once, during his initial hiring orientation. A man in a suit he didn't recognize. And Dr. Howard Ashford, the chair of the mathematics department, who was sitting in a folding chair with his legs crossed and an expression on his face like he'd eaten something that disagreed with him. Mr. Cole, Linda Price said, please, sit down. He sat. The chair was plastic and uncomfortable. The room smelled like industrial soap and stale coffee. On the table between them was a manila folder with his name on the tab. I'll get right to the point, Linda said. She opened the folder. We've received multiple formal complaints from faculty members regarding an incident that occurred in Whitmore Hall, room 412, on the night of November 14th. The complaints allege that you entered a restricted academic space outside of authorized hours and engaged in unauthorized interference with ongoing research. I was covering for Bill Frazier. I didn't know the room was restricted. The room has been on the restricted list since September, said the man in the suit. He hadn't introduced himself. The notification was distributed to all custodial staff via email. Bill's email, not mine. I was covering his shift. I didn't check his exclusion list because it was a last-minute swap. Regardless, Linda said, the complaints describe behavior that goes beyond a scheduling mix-up. Faculty members report that you accessed the whiteboard, altered research materials, and created a confrontation with Dr. Laurent in front of graduate students. Ethan felt something hot and tight building behind his ribs. I didn't alter anything. I identified an error, and there was no confrontation. She asked me to show her the problem, and I showed her. Dr. Ashford uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. He was a thin man in his 60s with silver hair and the particular kind of academic authority that came from decades of being deferred to. Mr. Cole, let me be frank. The mathematics department has a reputation to protect. Dr. Laurent's fellowship is one of the most prestigious arrangements this university has ever secured. When a custodial employee walks into a restricted research space and begins critiquing the work of a world-renowned scholar, it creates a perception problem. A perception problem, Ethan repeated. Yes. It suggests a lack of institutional boundaries. It raises questions about the security of sensitive academic work. And frankly, it's embarrassing. Embarrassing for who? Ashford's jaw tightened. For the university. Because a janitor found something your department missed? The room went very quiet. Linda Price looked down at her folder. The man in the suit studied his fingernails. Dr. Ashford stared at Ethan with an expression that had gone from uncomfortable to cold. Mr. Cole, Linda said carefully, the university has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately. You'll receive your final paycheck, including accrued vacation time, within 10 business days. Your health insurance coverage will continue through the end of the current month. The words landed and sat there, heavy and final, like furniture being placed in a room where it didn't belong. Ethan looked at the folder. He looked at Linda's hands, which were folded on top of it in a posture of professional sympathy that she'd probably practiced in a mirror. He looked at Dr. Ashford, who met his gaze without flinching, because men like Ashford had been making decisions about people like Ethan for so long that they'd forgotten those people were actually people. My insurance runs out at the end of the month, Ethan said. That's correct? My daughter has asthma. She has a pulmonologist, a pediatric allergist, and a recurring prescription that costs over $1,000 a month. The end of the month is 9 days away. We can provide you with information about COBRA continuation coverage. COBRA costs $600 a month. I make $14.60 an hour. Made, past tense, apparently. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. The math was the math, and unlike the equation on Vanessa Laurent's whiteboard, it was brutally simple. Is there anything else? Ethan asked. We'll need your badge and your building access card before you leave today. He reached into his pocket and pulled out both. He set them on the table next to the folder with his name on it. Then he stood up and he walked out of the room. And he didn't look back because looking back required a kind of energy he didn't have and couldn't spare. Dan was still in the hallway. He looked wrecked. Ethan, man, I'm sorry. I tried to push back. I told them it was a shift swap issue. They didn't care. I know, Dan. It's not your fault. What are you going to do? Ethan stood in the hallway of the maintenance building where he'd clocked in 5 nights a week for 4 years, where he'd stored his lunch in the communal fridge and changed into his coveralls and filled his mop bucket and begun the nightly ritual of cleaning a place that had once been his home in a different way. The fluorescent lights hummed. The water-stained ceiling tiles stared down at him. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, except that Ethan no longer belonged to it. I'm going to go home, he said, and I'm going to figure it out. He drove home in the dark. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call anyone. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road and his mind running calculations that had nothing to do with mathematics. Days until rent was due. Days until Chloe's prescription needed refilling. Days until the insurance lapsed. Dollars in his checking account. He pulled up the banking app at a red light and checked. $241.37. Mrs. Huang was still at the apartment when he got back. She took one look at his face and didn't ask questions. She just squeezed his arm as she passed him in the doorway and said, "Rice pudding is in the fridge." Then she was gone. Back to her apartment 2 doors down, and Ethan was alone in the kitchen with the stack of bills in the drawer and the humidifier humming in Chloe's room and the silence pressing in from all sides. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his notebook. Not to work. Not to write equations or chase proofs or pretend that the locked room in his mind was still closed. He opened it because it was the only thing in his life that still felt like it belonged to him. He stared at the blank page for 20 minutes. Then he closed the notebook and put his head down on the table and sat there in the dark. 3 days later, Chloe had the attack. It started at 2 a.m. Ethan woke to the sound. That particular wheeze that every asthma parent learns to hear through walls and sleep and dreams. The tight, whistling intake of air that sounds like someone trying to breathe through a straw. He was off the couch and in her room in 4 seconds. She was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, hands gripping the sheets. Professor Beans had fallen to the floor. Her chest was moving fast, too fast. The muscles between her ribs pulling in with each breath in a way that made Ethan's stomach drop. "Hey, hey, hey," he said, sitting beside her, one hand on her back. "I'm here. I'm right here. Let's do the inhaler first, okay?" She nodded. Couldn't speak. The rescue inhaler was on the nightstand. He shook it, held it to her mouth, pressed the canister. "Slow breath in. Hold it. Good. That's good, Chloe." 4 puffs. Wait 5 minutes. That was the protocol. He counted the minutes on his phone while holding her hand and keeping his voice steady and calm, the way Dr. Patel had taught him. The voice that said everything is under control even when everything was not under control. 5 minutes passed. The wheeze didn't improve. "Okay," Ethan said. "Nebulizer." He set up the machine, hands moving from muscle memory. Medication in the cup. Mask on her face. Power on. The machine started its drone. Chloe leaned against him, her small body trembling, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps between the misted medication. 10 minutes. Her breathing should have eased. It didn't. "Dad," she whispered. Her voice was thin and scared, and it broke something inside him that he hadn't known was still intact. "Dad, I can't." "I know, baby. We're going to the hospital, right now." He wrapped her in a blanket, scooped her up, grabbed his wallet and phone and car keys in one fumbling motion. He knocked on Mrs. Huang's door, didn't wait for an answer, shouted through the wood that he was taking Chloe to the ER. Then he was in the car, Chloe in the back seat buckled in with the blanket around her, the engine turning over once, twice, 3 times before catching. Children's Mercy was 18 minutes away. He made it in 12. He carried Chloe through the emergency room doors, and the triage nurse took one look at the retractions in her chest and the oxygen saturation reading on the pulse oximeter, 88%, dangerously low. And they were in a treatment room in under 2 minutes. Oxygen mask, IV line, continuous albuterol nebulization. A doctor appeared, young, tired, competent, and started asking questions that Ethan answered on autopilot. History of persistent moderate asthma, current medications, known triggers, allergies. When did the episode start? What interventions were attempted at home? "Has she been under any unusual stress recently?" the doctor asked. Ethan almost laughed. Stress. His 8-year-old daughter, who'd noticed that the refrigerator had been emptier than usual, who'd asked last week why they weren't getting pizza anymore, who'd heard him on the phone with the electric company negotiating a payment plan and had pretended to be asleep when he came to check on her afterward. Had she been under stress? "Some," Ethan said. They stabilized her within an hour. The oxygen brought her saturation up to 95, then 97. The nebulizer treatments eased the bronchospasm. By 4 a.m., Chloe was breathing normally, exhausted, asleep in the hospital bed with the oxygen cannula in her nose and the IV dripping in her arm. Ethan sat in the chair beside her bed. The room was small and beige and lit by the glow of monitoring equipment. Machines beeped in soft, rhythmic patterns. Through the curtain, he could hear another child crying and a parent's voice murmuring comfort. He pulled out his phone and checked his bank account. $241.37. The ER visit alone would be several thousand. The specialist follow-up, the medication adjustments, the potential admission if her oxygen dropped again overnight. He put the phone away and looked at his daughter. She was so small in the hospital bed. Her dark hair, Sarah's hair, exactly Sarah's, spread across the white pillow. Her hand, still attached to the pulse oximeter, lay open on the blanket, palm up, fingers curled slightly inward, and Ethan reached over and held it. He held it, and he did not let go. At some point, 5 a.m., maybe later, he pulled the spiral notebook from his jacket pocket. He'd grabbed it reflexively on the way out of the apartment, the way other people grab their wallets or their keys. It was as essential to him as either of those things, though he'd never have admitted it. He opened it to a page he'd been working on for the past week. A proof. Not the kind of proof that belonged to Vanessa Laurent or to Blackstone University or to any institution that had ever employed or discarded him. This was his. Something he'd been building in the margins of his survival, in the 30-minute windows between Chloe's bedtime and his work shifts, in the spaces where the rest of his life couldn't reach. He wrote. The pencil moved across the page, symbols and logic flowing in the dim light of the hospital room, while monitors beeped and his daughter breathed and the world outside the window went on without noticing that anything important was happening in this small beige room. He wrote for 2 hours. When he finished, he had 3 new pages of work that advanced the proof further than anything he'd produced in months. Something about the desperation had clarified his thinking. The noise was gone, the anxiety about money, the humiliation of being fired, the constant low-grade panic of survival. All of it had been replaced by a singular crystalline focus. His daughter was alive. She was breathing. And in the stillness of that relief, his mind had opened up in a way it hadn't since before Sarah died. The doctor came by at 7 a.m. for rounds. Chloe's vitals were stable. They wanted to keep her for observation, at least through the afternoon. Is there someone who can bring you a change of clothes? The nurse asked him. You look like you've been through it. I'm fine, Ethan said. There's coffee in the family lounge. Down the hall, second door on the left. He went to get coffee and stood in the family lounge. A room with vinyl chairs and a television playing morning news on mute, and a coffee maker that produced something that was technically coffee, in the same way a photograph of a sunset was technically a sunset. He poured a cup and drank it and tasted nothing. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Cole, this is Vanessa Laurent. I heard what happened. I need to speak with you. Where are you? He stared at the message. He read it 3 times. Then he typed a reply that was honest in a way he wouldn't have been capable of 24 hours earlier, because 24 hours earlier, he'd still had enough pride to pretend he was managing. Children's Mercy Hospital, room 314. My daughter is here. The reply came instantly. I'm on my way. He should have told her not to come. He should have said he didn't need anything from her. He should have guarded what little dignity he had left and handled this the way he'd handled everything for the past 4 years. Alone, stoically, with his jaw clenched and his notebook in his pocket, and his grief compressed into a shape small enough to carry. But he didn't, because at 7:15 on a November morning, sitting in a hospital family lounge with $47 in his checking account and his daughter asleep down the hall with an oxygen tube in her nose, Ethan Cole did not have the energy to pretend anymore. Vanessa arrived at 8:40. She came alone. No driver, no assistant. No Kevin, with his wireframe glasses and his laptop. She walked into the family lounge wearing jeans and a gray coat and no makeup, and she looked like a different person than the one who'd had him escorted out of room 412. Smaller, somehow, less assembled, more human. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him. He was still in the flannel shirt from yesterday. His eyes were red. The coffee cup in his hand had gone cold an hour ago. How is she? Vanessa asked. Stable. They're keeping her for observation. Vanessa sat down across from him. Not next to him. Across. She understood somehow that sitting next to him would have felt like comfort, and comfort wasn't what he could accept right now. "I found out this morning that the university fired you," she said. "Kevin heard it through the faculty grapevine. I want you to know that I had nothing to do with it." "I know." "The complaints came from the math department, Ashford and two of his faculty. They framed it as a security issue, but we both know what it actually was." "A janitor made them look stupid. Can't have that." "No, you can't." Vanessa leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Ethan, Mr. Cole, I reviewed your unfinished doctoral work. All of it. The thesis proposal, the unpublished drafts, the notes your advisor kept about your research trajectory. I also spoke with Raymond Okoro." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. A hairline fracture in the blankness. "You talked to Dr. Okoro?" "He told me you were the most gifted student he ever supervised. He also told me that losing you was his greatest failure." Ethan looked away. Out the window of the family lounge, a parking lot sat gray and unremarkable under a gray and unremarkable sky. A woman was loading a child into a car seat. An ambulance sat idle near the emergency entrance, its lights off. "None of that matters right now," he said. "It matters more right now than it ever has." Vanessa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. She placed it on the table between them. "I want to offer you 3 things. You can say no to all of them. You can say no to 2 of them and yes to 1. There's no obligation and no strings. I told you I'm not a charity case. And I told you I'm not trying to rescue you. I'm trying to correct an injustice. There's a difference, and you're smart enough to know it." He looked at the document. He didn't pick it up. "First," Vanessa said, "full payment for Chloe's medical treatment. All current balances plus a year of coverage through a private plan administered by my foundation. No repayment, no conditions. This is not generosity. This is what should have been available to you through the university's employment benefits, and it wasn't because the university's benefits are designed for people who don't actually need them." Ethan's jaw tightened. She pressed on. "Second, a fully funded research position through the Laurent Foundation's academic fellowship program. Salary, office space, full benefits, and complete intellectual freedom. You work on whatever you want. No teaching obligations, no committee assignments, no institutional politics. The position is yours for as long as you need it." She paused. Ethan was staring at the document. His hands were in his lap. His knuckles were white. "Third," Vanessa's voice changed, quieter. "I spent the last week going through your doctoral notes, your thesis proposal, the non-commutative framework for the homotopy conjecture. It's not just viable, it's extraordinary. But it's unfinished. So I did something that I need to tell you about before you hear it from anyone else." She reached into her coat again and pulled out a bound manuscript. It was thick, maybe 100 pages, with a blue cover and a title printed in plain black text. She set it on the table next to the document. "I took your framework and developed it. I filled in the gaps. I completed the proof you started 6 years ago, using your methodology, your approach, your mathematical language. It took me 5 days, and it is the hardest thing I have ever done." She tapped the manuscript. "Your name is the lead author. Mine is second. The work is yours. I just finished it." The silence in the family lounge was total. The muted television flickered. The coffee maker gurgled. Somewhere down the hall, a child's voice called out for a parent. Ethan picked up the manuscript. He held it in both hands and looked at the cover page. His name was there, printed in 12-point font. Cole, E.J., and Laurent, V.M. Below it, the title of the paper, which was dense and technical and meant nothing to anyone who wasn't fluent in the particular dialect of algebraic topology that lived inside it. He opened the manuscript and began reading. His eyes moved fast. Vanessa watched him the way she'd watched him solve the 3 problems in her office, with attention that was clinical on the surface and something much more complicated underneath. He read for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he set the manuscript down and looked at her. "Page 47, he said. "The transition from the 4th lemma to the 5th. You used a spectral sequence argument that I wouldn't have chosen. I know. Your notes suggested a different approach, but I couldn't make it work within the existing framework. The spectral sequence was a compromise. It's elegant. It's functional. Your approach would have been elegant. My approach didn't exist yet. You had to build with what was available. That's not a compromise. That's mathematics. Something happened to Vanessa's face then. A crack, similar to the one Ethan had seen in room 412, but deeper, less controlled. Her eyes were bright, her mouth pressed into a line that was trying very hard not to tremble. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan asked. Not hostile, not suspicious, genuinely asking. Vanessa looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because I've spent my entire career being the smartest person in the room, and when you walked into room 412 and proved me wrong in front of my own graduate students, my first instinct was to destroy you, to have you removed, discredited, silenced, because that's what I do. That's what people like me do to people who threaten us." She paused, swallowed. "And then I went home and I checked the math. And you were right. And I realized that my instinct, to destroy rather than acknowledge, was exactly the instinct that the university used when they fired you. And it was exactly the instinct that the academic world used when they let you disappear into a janitorial uniform without lifting a finger." She looked down at her hands. "My father was a dry cleaner. He pressed other people's suits his whole life. He never went to college. And he raised a daughter who became the kind of person who looks at a man in a janitor's uniform and sees nothing. He would be ashamed of me, and he'd be right." The family lounge was quiet. Ethan held the manuscript in his hands, his work, finished, real, existing in the physical world for the first time. "I can't promise you this fixes anything," Vanessa said. "I can't promise the academic world will accept you back. I can't promise the money will solve your problems, or the research position will make you happy. But I can promise you that for the first time in my life, I'm doing something because it's right. Not because it's strategic, not because it's profitable, because it's right." Ethan looked at the manuscript. He looked at the document with the financial offer. He looked at Vanessa, sitting across from him in a hospital family lounge at 9 a.m. on a November morning, wearing no makeup and speaking in a voice that had abandoned every defense she'd ever built. "I need to think about it," he said. "Take all the time you need. And I need to go check on my daughter." "Of course." He stood up. He held the manuscript against his chest with one arm, not like a document, like something he was protecting. He walked toward the door, then stopped. "Dr. Laurent?" "Yes?" "The spectral sequence on page 47. You were right to use it. But there's a cleaner path through if you substitute the Mayer-Vietoris sequence at step 3 instead of step 5. It eliminates 2 pages of intermediate work, and the result is tighter." He said it the way someone might mention that a painting would look better moved 2 inches to the left, casually, naturally, as if seeing the improvement cost him no effort at all. Then he walked down the hall to room 314, where Chloe was awake now, sitting up in bed, asking the nurse if the hospital had any orange juice and whether the oxygen tube in her nose made her look like a robot. Ethan sat down beside her. She reached for his hand. He gave it to her. "Dad, what's that?" She was looking at the manuscript. "Just some work." "From your notebook?" "Sort of." "Is it math?" "Yeah, baby, it's math." She studied him with those brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, always Sarah's eyes, and said, "Are you okay?" He looked at her. His daughter. His whole world sitting in a hospital bed in a paper gown with an oxygen tube in her nose and a stuffed rabbit wedged beside her pillow. 8 years old. Brave and smart and fragile and strong and everything he'd ever done right, compressed into one small, breathing, impossible person. "Yeah," he said. "I think I might be." Chloe was discharged on a Friday afternoon, 48 hours after admission, with a revised medication plan and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. Dr. Patel had adjusted her controller inhaler to a higher dose and added an oral corticosteroid taper for the next 10 days. The discharge paperwork came in a plastic folder that the nurse handed to Ethan with a smile and a reminder to call if anything changed. The bill came separately. It arrived in his email before they'd even reached the parking lot. $4,811. Emergency department services, observation stay, respiratory therapy, labs, imaging, pharmacy. The number sat on his phone screen like a sentence handed down by a judge who hadn't bothered to look at the defendant. He buckled Chloe into the back seat. She was holding Professor Beans and a coloring book a volunteer had given her on the ward, and she was already chattering about a boy in the next room who'd broken his arm falling off a trampoline and had let her sign his cast. "I wrote Chloe C. and drew a star," she said. "He said it was the best signature he'd gotten so far, better than his mom's." "That's because you have excellent penmanship." "What's penmanship?" "Handwriting." "Then why didn't you just say handwriting?" "Because I'm a show-off," she giggled. He started the car. The engine caught on the second try, which was an improvement. He hadn't called Vanessa back. He hadn't called anyone. For 2 days, while Chloe recovered in the hospital, Ethan had sat beside her bed and read to her and helped her with a math worksheet the nurses had printed from the children's education portal, and he'd held the manuscript in his lap during the hours she slept and read it cover to cover 3 times. It was good, more than good. It was rigorous and bold and structurally sound, and Vanessa had handled his framework with a kind of care that he hadn't expected. She hadn't imposed her own style on it. She hadn't overwritten his voice. She'd listened to his mathematical language, the way he built arguments, the particular patterns of logic that were as distinctive as a fingerprint, and she'd continued in that language rather than translating it into her own. That was rare. That took humility. And Vanessa Laurent was not a woman he would have associated with humility until very recently. But there were things he would have done differently. The spectral sequence on page 47 was one. A lemma in section 3 that could have been strengthened with a different set of base cases was another. And the conclusion, the final page, where the proof resolved into its completed form, was correct but blunt, like a novel with a perfect plot and a rushed ending. He could make it sing. He knew he could. The music was already in his head. He also knew that accepting Vanessa's offer meant accepting that the last 4 years hadn't been a permanent sentence, that the man who wrote those doctoral notes still existed somewhere inside the man who mopped floors and counted dollars and fell asleep on a couch with a broken spring. And that idea, the possibility that he could be more than what survival had made him, was so enormous and so terrifying that he'd been circling it for 2 days the way you circle a bonfire, wanting the warmth, but afraid of the burn. They got home at 3 p.m. Mrs. Huang had left soup on the stove and a note that said, "Welcome home, little one," with a smiley face drawn in blue pen. Chloe ate 2 bowls and fell asleep on the couch watching the octopus documentary she'd been halfway through before the hospital. Ethan covered her with a blanket. He checked her breathing, even, steady, 16 per minute. He stood over her for a long time, watching the blanket rise and fall. And then he went to the kitchen and picked up his phone and called the number Vanessa had texted from. She answered on the second ring. "Ethan, we're not on a first-name basis." A pause, then, "Old habits. Mr. Cole. I read the manuscript, all 3 times. And? And I have notes." He heard something on the other end that might have been a laugh, short, surprised, almost involuntary. "Of course you do. I also have a question." "Go ahead." "If I accept this, the position, the funding, whatever it is, who do I answer to?" "Nobody. The fellowship is structured as an independent research appointment. You set your own agenda, your own timeline, your own scope. The foundation provides the funding and the infrastructure. You provide the work. And you? What about me? What's your role? You funded it. You completed my manuscript. You're not going to just disappear into the background. I'll be a collaborator if you want one, an investor if you don't, whatever you need. What I need is for my daughter to have health insurance by Monday." "Done. I activated the private coverage plan 2 days ago. Your confirmation documents are in your email. All of Chloe's current providers are in-network, including Dr. Patel." Ethan pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at it. Then he opened his email. 3 unread messages from the Laurent Foundation Benefits Administration. He opened the first one. Coverage confirmation. Chloe M. Cole, dependent. Effective date? November 21st, 2 days ago, while she was still in the hospital. "You did this before I agreed to anything," he said. "I did." "That's presumptuous." "No, it's urgent. There's a difference." He wanted to argue. He wanted to push back the way he'd been pushing back against everything for 4 years, with pride, with stubbornness, with the particular brand of self-reliance that was really just fear wearing a different coat. But his daughter was asleep on the couch 30 feet away, breathing clearly for the first time in a week. And the woman on the other end of the phone had made that possible without being asked. "The spectral sequence on page 47, he said. "I told you there's a cleaner path using Meyer via Torus at step 3. "You did." "I want to rewrite it, and section 3 needs stronger base cases, and the conclusion needs to breathe." "Then come rewrite it." "When?" "Whenever you're ready. The office is set up, 4th floor of the Laurent Foundation building in Cambridge. Suite 402. There's a desk, a whiteboard, a coffee machine that actually works, and a window that overlooks a park where your daughter can play when the weather isn't trying to kill everyone. You set up an office for me before I agreed. Presumptuous. I know. Ethan closed his eyes. The kitchen was quiet. Chloe's breathing drifted in from the living room, steady and rhythmic and alive. The refrigerator hummed, the radiator ticked, the bills sat in the drawer, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the thought of opening that drawer didn't make his chest tighten. "Monday," he said. "I'll come on Monday." "I'll be there." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, holding the phone, staring at the insurance confirmation on the screen. Then he opened the drawer. He pulled out the stack of envelopes, the medical bills, the overdue electric notice, the credit card warning, the termination letter from Blackstone. He spread them across the table, and for the first time he looked at all of them at once instead of one at a time. The total was staggering. The hospital bills alone, including the ER visit, were over $7,000. The credit card balance had climbed to $4,600. The electric company wanted $94 plus a $25 late fee. The rent was due in 3 days. Add it all up and you got a number that would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. Roughly $14,000, give or take, which was more than Ethan had earned in the last 3 months combined. But the insurance confirmation on his phone said that Chloe's medical bills, past, present, and future, were covered. And the fellowship offer, which he hadn't fully read yet, included a salary that he pulled up now on his laptop. The number sat on the screen and Ethan read it 3 times because his eyes kept refusing to process it. $85,000 per year. Benefits. Office space, research funding. He sat down. He put his head in his hands. And for the first time since Sarah died, Ethan Cole cried. Not a lot. Not dramatically. Just a few minutes of it, quiet and private, hunched over the kitchen table in a flannel shirt with his daughter sleeping 30 feet away, and his life cracked open like an egg, messy and raw, and impossible to put back together the way it was before. Then he wiped his face, blew his nose on a paper towel, and started making a list of things he needed to do before Monday. The Laurent Foundation occupied 2 floors of a renovated brick building on Kendall Street in Cambridge, sandwiched between a biotech startup and a coffee shop that charged $7 for a pour-over. The building had been a textile factory in the 1920s, and the original beams and exposed brick had been preserved with the kind of careful expense that made everything look simultaneously old and expensive. Suite 402 was on the 4th floor. Ethan arrived at 9:15 a.m. on Monday, wearing the same flannel shirt he'd worn to Vanessa's office weeks earlier. He owned 3 flannel shirts and rotated them. And carrying a backpack that contained his spiral notebook, 2 pens, a granola bar, and a photograph of Chloe that he'd tucked into the front pocket without fully acknowledging why. The office was modest by Vanessa's standards, which meant it was the nicest room Ethan had occupied in years. A desk, a chair, a whiteboard that took up an entire wall, a bookshelf stocked with current journals and reference texts, and the window Vanessa had mentioned, which did indeed overlook a small park with benches and bare trees, and a playground where a few children were climbing despite the cold. Vanessa was already there. She was sitting at a second desk, smaller, pushed into the corner, with her laptop open and a stack of papers beside her. She looked different than she had at the hospital. More composed, back in the blazer and heels. But something in her posture was softer, less armored, like she'd made a deliberate decision to leave one layer of defense at home. "You're late," she said. "I dropped Chloe at school. There was a line." "How is she?" "Better?" She asked the teacher if she could bring Professor Beans to show and tell. The teacher said no. Chloe negotiated it down to a photograph of Professor Beans, which she is currently carrying in a Ziploc bag. Vanessa's mouth twitched, almost a smile. She's a negotiator. She's relentless, gets it from her mother. The mention of Sarah landed in the room quietly, without drama, like a leaf settling on still water. Vanessa didn't react to it visibly, but she heard it, and Ethan could tell she heard it because she paused for exactly one beat before continuing. The manuscript is on your desk. I printed a clean copy with margins for notes. And the original proofs you referenced in your thesis proposal are in the binder on the shelf. You found those? Okoro kept copies. He mailed them to me. Ethan walked to the bookshelf and pulled out the binder. Inside were pages he hadn't seen in 4 years. His own handwriting, dense and energetic, covering topics he'd been exploring in his final year of doctoral work. Seeing them was like finding a letter from a younger version of himself, someone who'd been brilliant and hopeful and had no idea what was coming. He opened the manuscript to page 47 and sat down. They worked. For the first week, they worked mostly in silence. Ethan rewrote the spectral sequence, then rewrote it again, then threw both versions out and started from a completely different angle that produced something better than either. Vanessa watched him work without comment, making notes on her own laptop, occasionally leaving the room to take calls about Meridian Ventures' business that couldn't wait. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that the work was more important than the conversation, and that the best thing they could do for each other was stay out of each other's way. By the second week, the silence started to crack. Small fissures at first. Ethan asked Vanessa to check a derivation. Vanessa asked Ethan to explain a notation choice. They disagreed about the structure of Section 3 and argued about it for 45 minutes, Ethan pacing in front of the whiteboard with a marker in his hand, and Vanessa sitting at her desk with her arms crossed, neither of them willing to concede until Ethan suddenly stopped mid-sentence and said, "Wait, you're right, but not for the reason you think." And then he wrote something on the whiteboard that merged both their approaches into a result that was stronger than either one alone, and Vanessa stared at it for a full minute before saying quietly, "That's beautiful." "It's functional," Ethan said. "Same thing you said about the spectral sequence." "No, that was functional. This is beautiful. There's a difference." He looked at her. She looked at the whiteboard. And something shifted between them that neither of them named or acknowledged, because naming it would have made it real, and real was dangerous for both of them, for different reasons. Ethan picked Chloe up from school at 2:45 every day without exception. That was non-negotiable. The work could wait, the proofs could wait, the career resurrection that Vanessa was engineering with her money and her influence, and her peculiar, fierce brand of determination could wait. Chloe could not. He brought her to the office sometimes, on days when Mrs. Huang had appointments. Chloe sat on the floor with her homework spread out around her and Professor Beans propped against the desk leg, and she worked alongside them in companionable concentration, occasionally asking Ethan to check her multiplication tables or spell a word she couldn't figure out. Vanessa, who had no experience with children and had never displayed any particular interest in them, handled Chloe's presence with an awkwardness that Ethan found unexpectedly endearing. She spoke to Chloe the way she spoke to board members, formally, precisely, with a slight stiffness that suggested she wasn't entirely sure how much to adjust her vocabulary. "Are you working on long division?" Vanessa asked one afternoon, looking over Chloe's shoulder at her math worksheet. "Yep." "That's an important skill. Division is the foundation of rational number theory." Chloe looked up at her. "What's rational number theory?" It's a branch of mathematics that deals with numbers that can be expressed as fractions." "Like a half?" "Exactly like a half." "I already know about halves. Can I have a snack?" Vanessa opened her desk drawer and produced a granola bar, which she handed to Chloe with the careful precision of someone diffusing an explosive. Ethan watched the exchange from the whiteboard, where he was deep in a derivation, and something warm and unexpected moved through his chest. It wasn't attraction, exactly. It wasn't gratitude, though gratitude was part of it. It was the recognition that Vanessa Laurent, the billionaire who'd had him thrown out of a classroom and who ran a $2 billion fund with the emotional warmth of a glacier, was trying. Awkwardly, imperfectly, with zero natural talent for it, she was trying. The manuscript evolved. Ethan rewrote the conclusion over 3 days, turning the final proof into something that built slowly and resolved with a clarity that made Vanessa set down her pen and sit back in her chair when she read it. "You didn't just fix the ending," she said. "You changed what the paper means. I made it say what it always wanted to say. It just didn't have the language yet. That's not how most mathematicians talk about their work. Most mathematicians didn't learn to talk by reading bedtime stories to an 8-year-old. Vanessa looked at him. He looked at the whiteboard. The moment passed without resolution, which was becoming a pattern between them. These small collisions of honesty that opened a door and then closed it before either of them could decide whether to walk through. The paper was submitted to the Annals of Mathematics in the first week of December. Vanessa handled the logistics, formatting, cover letters, the political choreography of academic publishing that Ethan had never understood and didn't care to learn. He reviewed the final version one last time, made 2 small corrections in the margins, and signed the submission form. His hand shook slightly when he wrote his name. He hadn't signed an academic document in 4 years. The pen felt different than the mop handle, lighter and more dangerous, like a tool that could build something instead of just cleaning up after it. While the paper was under review, Vanessa began her campaign. She didn't call it that. She called it visibility work, which sounded gentler than what it actually was. A strategic, relentless, and occasionally ruthless effort to force the academic establishment to acknowledge Ethan Cole's existence. She started by emailing the paper's abstract to 17 leading mathematicians in the field, including 3 editors of major journals and 2 past recipients of the Fields Medal. She invited them to a private seminar at the Laurent Foundation where Ethan would present the work. "I don't do seminars," Ethan said when she told him. "You do now." "I haven't stood in front of an audience in 4 years. "Then it's time." Vanessa. It was the first time he'd used her first name. They both noticed. Neither mentioned it. "I'm not going to stand in front of a room full of people who spent the last 4 years ignoring me and pretend I'm grateful for their attention," he said. "I'm not asking you to be grateful. I'm asking you to be yourself. Walk them through the proof. Answer their questions. Let the work speak. And if they don't listen, they'll listen. The work is too good to ignore. And if they try, I'll make it very uncomfortable for them." That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be honest. The seminar was held on a gray December afternoon in a conference room at the Laurent Foundation that seated 40 and was standing room only by the time Ethan began. Word had spread. The Janitor story, because of course it had become a story, embellished and distorted and passed around academic departments like contraband, had created a curiosity that the abstract alone hadn't. People came to see the spectacle. They stayed for the mathematics. Ethan stood at the front of the room in a shirt Vanessa had talked him into buying. A navy button-down, nothing fancy, but new, which was itself a novelty. And he walked them through the proof from beginning to end. His voice was steady. His hands were not. The marker shook slightly when he wrote on the whiteboard, and he knew that everyone in the room could see it, and he didn't try to hide it because hiding it would have taken energy he needed for the math. The questions came hard and fast. A topologist from Princeton challenged his base assumptions. A Fields laureate from Chicago questioned his methodology. An editor from the Annals, one of the people who would decide whether to publish the paper, asked him to justify a specific step in the proof that she found unconventional. Ethan answered each one, not with the slick, practiced confidence of someone who'd spent years on the seminar circuit, with something rawer and more honest, the confidence of someone who knew the work was right because he'd lived inside it, because he'd built it in hospital rooms, and at kitchen tables and in the 30-minute windows, between putting his daughter to bed and putting on his coveralls. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then the topologist from Princeton began to clap, slowly at first, then others joined. The Fields laureate, the journal editor, the graduate students who'd been standing against the back wall. It wasn't thunderous, it wasn't a standing ovation. It was the particular measured applause of people who understood what they'd just witnessed and needed a moment to recalibrate their assumptions. Vanessa was sitting in the second row. She didn't clap. She just watched Ethan with an expression that she would have denied if anyone had described it to her. an expression of admiration so complete that it bordered on something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to name. After the seminar, the Princeton topologist approached Ethan by the coffee table. "Dr. Cole," or, "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole?" "Ethan is fine." "Ethan, that was remarkable work. The non-commutative framework is genuinely novel. I have some thoughts about potential extensions that I'd love to discuss." "I'd like that." "Where are you based? What department?" "I'm not at a department. I'm at a foundation." "Which university?" "No university. Just a desk and a whiteboard and a woman who keeps telling me to stop underestimating myself." The topologist looked at him with an expression that was half confusion and half respect, which Ethan was beginning to realize was the expression most people would give him for the foreseeable future. He didn't fit any of the categories they knew. Not a professor, not a postdoc, not an industry researcher. Just a man with a notebook and a cracked-handle mop somewhere in his recent past, and a daughter who drew stars on strangers' casts. That night, after Chloe was in bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open and his phone next to it. The screen showed a text from Vanessa, sent 30 minutes earlier. The Annals accepted the paper. Expedited review. Publication in the March issue. He read the message. He read it again. Then he set the phone down and looked at the notebook. His cheap, water-stained, 79-cent spiral notebook. And he thought about all the pages he'd filled in this apartment, at this table, in the dark hours between survival and sleep. Every equation, every proof, every idea that had come to him in the liminal space between who he was and who the world said he was. All of it, written in pencil on cheap paper, carried in his jacket pocket next to grocery lists and overdue notices and his daughter's school permission slips. He picked up his pencil and turned to a fresh page. But instead of an equation, he wrote 2 words at the top, in handwriting that was small and careful and nothing like his usual mathematical scrawl. "Thank you." He didn't send it to anyone. He didn't show it to anyone. He just wrote it, there in the silence of his kitchen, with the radiator ticking and the refrigerator humming and Chloe breathing steadily in the next room. And then he turned the page and started working on his next proof. The paper published in March, and by April the emails started. Not a trickle. A flood. Ethan opened his inbox on a Tuesday morning and found 47 unread messages from addresses ending in .edu. Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Columbia, ETH Zurich, the University of Tokyo. Department chairs. Program directors. Endowed professors whose names appeared in the textbooks Ethan had studied a decade ago. All of them writing with some variation of the same message. "We've read your paper. We'd like to talk. Are you available?" He read the first 12. Then he closed the laptop and took Chloe to the park. It was the first truly warm day of the year, the kind of early April morning where New England finally exhales after months of holding its breath. The trees in the park near the Laurent Foundation building, the same park visible from Ethan's office window, had that tentative green haze that precedes real leaves, the suggestion of something about to happen. Chloe was on the swings, pumping her legs with the furious concentration of a child who has recently decided that going higher is the most important thing in the world. "Dad, watch this," she called. "I'm watching." "No, really watch. I'm going to go so high my feet touch the sky." "Your feet are not going to touch the sky." "You don't know that." "I do know that. Gravity knows that." "Maybe gravity is wrong." Ethan laughed. He was sitting on a bench with his notebook in his lap, always the notebook, always within reach, and the spring sun was warm on his face. Chloe's breathing had been stable for 3 months. Her last pulmonology appointment had been the best in 2 years. Dr. Patel had actually used the word excellent, which was not a word Dr. Patel used lightly, and Chloe had interpreted it as permission to run everywhere at maximum speed, which had given Ethan a different kind of anxiety entirely. She was thriving. That word kept coming back to him, arriving in quiet moments like this one, sitting on a bench watching his daughter try to kick the sky. Thriving. Not surviving, not managing, not getting by. Thriving. The difference between those words was the distance between the kitchen table in their old apartment and this bench in this park, and Ethan still sometimes had trouble believing he'd crossed it. His phone buzzed, a text from Vanessa. "The MIT department chair wants to have lunch. Should I tell him you're available or that you're too busy being a genius to eat? He typed back, tell him Tuesday. And I'm not a genius. I'm a guy who's good at patterns. You're impossible. I learned from the best. He put the phone away and watched Chloe swing. The chains creaked rhythmically. A dog trotted past with its owner. Somewhere nearby, a street musician was playing guitar, the notes drifting across the park in fragments. He still hadn't forgiven Vanessa. Not fully. That was the thing nobody talked about. The gap between gratitude and forgiveness, the way you could be genuinely thankful for what someone had done while still carrying the memory of what they'd done before. Vanessa had changed his life. She'd also, before that, helped create the conditions that nearly ended it. She'd mocked him in room 412. She'd called security. She'd sat in that room surrounded by her graduate students and laughed at him. That short, cold courtroom laugh. And even though everything after that had been an attempt at correction, the original wound was still there, healing but not healed. He'd told her this 3 weeks ago, late on a Friday evening, when they were the only two people left in the office and the work had reached a natural pause and the silence between them had grown thick enough to walk on. I'm grateful for what you've done, he'd said, not looking at her, looking at the whiteboard. But I need you to know that I haven't forgotten how it started. Vanessa had been quiet for a long time. Long enough that Ethan had turned to check if she'd heard him. She was sitting at her desk with her hands folded, and her face had that particular stillness she got when she was processing something she didn't have a ready response for. You shouldn't forget it, she'd said finally. I don't want you to forget it. If you forget it, then I can pretend it didn't matter. And it mattered. It did. I was cruel to you, not just dismissive, cruel. I looked at you and saw a janitor, and I decided that a janitor couldn't possibly understand something I didn't. And when you proved me wrong, my first instinct was to punish you for it. She paused. That's not the kind of person I want to be, but it's the kind of person I was in that room. Past tense? Working on it. He'd looked at her then. Really looked. The way he'd been avoiding for weeks, because looking at Vanessa Laurent too closely always revealed more than he was prepared to deal with. And what he'd seen wasn't the billionaire or the research fellow or the woman on the Forbes list. He'd seen someone who was lonely in a way that money couldn't fix and success couldn't fill. Someone who'd built an empire on the ruins of a father who pressed other people's suits and died before he could see what his daughter became. Someone who worked 16-hour days not because she loved the work, though she did, but because stopping meant sitting with a silence that had no one in it. We're not that different, he'd said. We're very different. We both built walls to keep from falling apart. Yours is just more expensive. She'd almost smiled. Almost. The corner of her mouth had moved a fraction of an inch, and then she'd looked away, and the moment had closed like a book being set down. He hadn't pushed. Pushing wasn't something Ethan did. He'd learned, in the years since Sarah, that the important things arrived on their own schedule. Grief, healing, connection, trust. You couldn't force any of them. You could only leave the door open and wait. The lunch with the MIT department chair happened the following Tuesday. Dr. Arthur Keene was a compact, energetic man in his late 50s who spoke in rapid paragraphs and ate his salad with the speed of someone who resented the time food required. They met at a restaurant in Kendall Square that was too nice for Ethan's comfort and not nice enough for Keene's, which put them on approximately equal footing. I'll be blunt, Keene said before the appetizers arrived. Your paper is the most significant contribution to algebraic topology in at least a decade. The non-commutative framework alone is publishable, but the proof itself, the way you resolve the homotopy conjecture using that framework, it's going to redefine how people approach the field. That's generous. It's not generous. It's accurate. And I don't say things to be generous. Ask anyone who works for me. Ethan ate a piece of bread. It was very good bread. He wasn't used to very good bread, and the novelty of it distracted him from the magnitude of what Keene was saying. We want to offer you a position, Keene continued, full professorship, tenure track, with an accelerated review given your publication record. You'd have a lab, graduate students, full research funding, basically everything the university can offer to someone we really want. I didn't finish my doctorate. I'm aware. The appointment would be contingent on completing your PhD, which, given that your published paper essentially constitutes a thesis, would be largely a formality. We'd assign you an advisor. Probably me, if you can stand me, and fast-track the defense. 6 months, tops. You're offering me a PhD and a professorship at the same time. We're offering you what you should have had 10 years ago if the system hadn't failed you. That landed harder than Keene probably intended. Ethan set down the bread. He looked out the window at the street where people were walking to work in their coats and scarves, carrying coffees and laptops, living their ordinary lives with their ordinary problems, and he thought about the extraordinary absurdity of sitting in a restaurant being offered a tenured professorship by a man who'd spent 45 seconds deciding that the most important thing about Ethan Cole was his brain. I need to think about it, Ethan said. Of course. And I need to talk to someone. Take your time, but not too much time. Stanford is calling you next week. He told Vanessa about the offer that afternoon. She was in the office, reviewing a contract for Meridian Ventures that had been couriered over and required her signature before 5 p.m. MIT offered me a full professorship, he said, standing in the doorway. Vanessa set down her pen. Tenure track? Tenure track with a fast-tracked PhD completion. When? Whenever I want. And Stanford? How did you know about Stanford? Because I know everyone at Stanford, and 2 of them texted me this morning asking if you're available. This is your doing, isn't it? The seminar, the publication, the emails. I opened the door. You walked through it. There's a difference. You keep saying that because you keep needing to hear it. He walked into the office and sat down at his desk. The whiteboard behind him was covered in his handwriting. New work, a new proof, something he'd started the previous week that had nothing to do with the published paper and everything to do with the fact that his mind, once unlocked, refused to stop moving. Vanessa. Yes? I'm going to take the MIT position. I know. It means leaving this office. I know that too. I want you to know that this, he gestured at the room, the whiteboard, the 2 desks, the coffee machine, the window overlooking the park where Chloe had tried to kick the sky. This mattered. Not just the money, not just the insurance. This. He gestured again, more specifically this time, at the space between them. Working with you, arguing about spectral sequences, watching you try to give my daughter a granola bar like it was a stick of dynamite. Vanessa looked at him. Her face did the thing it did when she was trying not to feel something. The careful blankness, the controlled stillness. But her eyes gave her away. They always gave her away, though she didn't know it, because the people in Vanessa Laurent's life had never been brave enough to tell her that her eyes were the most honest part of her. You're welcome, she said, and then quieter. And thank you. For what? For not letting me be the person I was in room 412. For making me better than that. I didn't make you anything. You chose it. You gave me a reason to. The moment stretched between them, warm and complicated and full of things that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet. Then Vanessa's phone rang. A board call. Can't miss it. And she picked it up and turned away. And Ethan opened his notebook and started writing, and they were back in the rhythm of the work again. The 2 of them in their separate corners of the same room, connected by mathematics and something else. Something they'd get around to naming eventually, when they were both ready. 6 months later, on a bright September morning that felt like the first page of a book he hadn't known he was writing, Ethan walked into a classroom at MIT, not room 412. A different room, in a different building, on a different campus. Room 217 of the Simons Building, which housed the Department of Mathematics, and was named after a donor whose money came from hedge funds, which was a different kind of irony than the kind Ethan was used to, but irony nonetheless. The room held 60 seats arranged in a tiered lecture format, a podium at the front, and a whiteboard that stretched the entire width of the wall. The whiteboard was blank. Ethan stood in front of it with a marker in his hand. Not a mop, not a bucket, not a cracked handle wrapped in duct tape. And he looked out at the students filing in. Graduate students, mostly. 24 of them registered for advanced topics in algebraic topology, a new course designed by Ethan and approved by the department with unusual speed, partly because of the paper's impact, and partly because Arthur Keene had threatened to do something unspecified but apparently terrifying if the curriculum committee delayed. The students took their seats. They opened laptops and notebooks. They looked at Ethan with the particular expression of graduate students encountering a new professor. Curious, slightly nervous, already calculating how hard the course would be. Ethan looked at them and thought about Bill Frazier, who was probably still calling in sick for his girlfriend's birthdays. He thought about Gary the security guard and his 1994 mustache. He thought about Dan Kowalski and his khaki pants and his Labrador photo. He thought about the 187,000-mile Civic and the broken spring in the couch and the humidifier that ran all night and misses. Wong's rice pudding and the $14 payroll discrepancy that he'd once spent 40 minutes on the phone trying to fix because $14 was the difference between groceries and not. He thought about Sarah, not with the crushing weight that used to accompany her name, but with a softer ache. The kind that meant the grief had changed shape without diminishing, that it had become part of him rather than the thing destroying him. She would have been proud today. She would have been proud every day. She would have also told him his shirt was wrinkled because it was, because Ethan still hadn't learned to iron properly and probably never would. "Good morning," he said. His voice was steady, his hands were not. The marker trembled slightly, and he didn't try to hide it. "My name is Dr. Cole. This is Advanced Topics in Algebraic Topology. Over the next 16 weeks, we're going to explore some ideas that most textbooks tell you are impossible. We're going to take apart structures that have been assumed to be fixed, and we're going to rebuild them using tools that some of you haven't seen before and that I, frankly, am still in the process of inventing." He uncapped the marker and turned to the whiteboard. "But first, I want to tell you something that nobody told me when I was sitting where you are. Mathematics isn't about being smart. I know that sounds wrong. This is a math department. Everyone here is smart, but being smart is the price of admission. It gets you through the door. What keeps you in the room, what makes the work matter, is something else entirely. It's stubbornness. It's the willingness to sit with a problem that won't yield and to come back to it the next day and the next and the next, even when the world tells you to stop, especially when the world tells you to stop." He wrote the first equation on the board. The marker didn't shake anymore. "Let's begin." For the next 90 minutes, he taught. He filled the whiteboard with notation and then erased it and filled it again. He guided students through problems that started simple and grew complex, pacing in front of the board with the kind of energy that comes from doing something you were built to do. He asked questions and waited for answers and didn't flinch when the answers were wrong, because wrong answers were just correct answers that hadn't been pushed far enough yet. The room listened. Not because he was famous, though the story had traveled, and most of his students knew some version of it, distorted and romanticized in the way that stories always are when they pass through enough mouths. They listened because Ethan Cole taught the way he solved problems, with his whole self, holding nothing back, treating each student's confusion as a legitimate mathematical question rather than a failure to keep up. At the back of the room, in the last row of seats, two people sat together. Vanessa Laurent had arrived 10 minutes before the class started, slipping in through the rear door in a way that suggested she was trying not to be noticed, which was difficult for a billionaire in a room full of graduate students, but she was doing her best. She wore a simple black sweater and jeans, no blazer, no heels, and her hair was down, which Ethan had never seen before and which made her look younger, less defended, more like the person she was when no one from Forbes was watching. Beside her, in the seat to her left, sat Chloe. She was 9 now. Her birthday had been in July, celebrated with a cake from a bakery that wasn't the cheapest option and wasn't the most expensive either, which Ethan had chosen deliberately because he was done with both extremes. And she was holding Professor Beans in her lap with the casual authority of a child who has decided that her stuffed rabbit belongs everywhere she goes and the world can deal with it. Chloe watched her father teach. Her legs, too short to reach the floor, swung gently above the carpet. She didn't understand the equations. She didn't need to. She understood the other thing, the thing that mathematics was just the language for, which was that her father was standing at the front of a room full of people, and none of them were looking at him with pity or contempt or the polite blindness that the world reserves for people it has decided not to see. They were looking at him with respect, with attention, with the focused engagement of minds that recognized they were in the presence of something exceptional. Ethan was explaining a concept, something about group actions and orbit spaces, and he paused mid-sentence to redraw a diagram that wasn't clear enough. As he erased and redrew, he glanced up, and his eyes found the back of the room. He saw Vanessa first. She was sitting perfectly still, watching him with an expression he'd learned to read over the past 6 months. The expression she wore when she was feeling something she didn't want to name but couldn't entirely suppress. Admiration. Connection. The complicated, undefined thing that lived in the space between two people who had been terrible to each other and were now trying to build something better than what they'd destroyed. Then he saw Chloe, his daughter, with her stuffed rabbit and her swinging legs and Sarah's brown eyes, sitting in a university lecture hall watching her father do the thing he was born to do. Something moved through Ethan's chest. Not the old weight, the compressed grief, the constant pressure that had lived between his ribs for 5 years. This was different, lighter, expansive. It felt like the first full breath after a long illness. The kind of breath where your lungs remember their actual capacity and your body remembers what it feels like to not be in survival mode. He smiled at Chloe. She waved at him with one hand, a small, discreet wave that was clearly trying to be subtle and failing completely. 2 students in the row ahead of her turned around, saw the kid with the stuffed rabbit, and turned back with confused grins. Ethan returned to the diagram. He finished the redraw, completed the explanation, and moved on to the next problem. The class continued. The whiteboard filled up. The students asked questions that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes confused and always sincere, and Ethan answered everyone with the patience of someone who understood, from personal experience, that the distance between confusion and understanding was never as far as it looked. At 11:30, the class ended. Students packed up their things, a few lingered to ask follow-up questions, and Ethan answered them while keeping one eye on the back of the room, where Chloe was now showing Professor Beans to a graduate student who appeared both charmed and bewildered by the interaction. The room emptied gradually. The lingering students drifted out. The graduate student who'd been introduced to Professor Beans left with a wave, and then it was just the 3 of them. Ethan at the front, Vanessa and Chloe at the back. Chloe hopped down from her seat and ran down the aisle to her father. He caught her in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and squeezed with the strength of a child who has not yet learned to hold anything back. "That was so long," she said into his shoulder. "Do you always talk that much?" "Only about math." "You talk a lot about math at home, too." "I talk a normal amount about math." "You were literally doing math in your sleep last night. I heard you say homotopy while you were snoring." "I don't snore." "You absolutely snore. Vanessa, tell him he snores." Vanessa had made her way down the aisle and was standing a few feet away with her hands in her coat pockets and an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was failing in the same way Chloe's wave had failed, obviously, endearingly, completely. "I wouldn't know," Vanessa said. "I've never heard him sleep." "Trust me," Chloe said with the absolute authority of a 9-year-old. "It's loud." Ethan set Chloe down. She immediately grabbed his hand with one of hers and Professor Beans with the other, creating a chain of connection that included her father and her rabbit, and by proximity, the woman standing beside them, who had not yet been incorporated into the chain, but who was, by the geometry of the moment, closer than she'd been 6 months ago. Closer than she'd been willing to be. "How was it?" Ethan asked Vanessa. He meant the lecture. She heard the larger question. "Terrifying," she said, "in the best possible way." "Terrifying how?" "Terrifying like watching someone do something so well that it makes you reconsider everything you thought you knew about what excellence looks like." She paused. "Also, you have marker on your forehead." Ethan rubbed his forehead. His hand came away blue. Chloe laughed, a genuine, full-body 8-year-old turning 9-year-old laugh that filled the empty classroom and bounced off the tiered seats and the blank whiteboard and the windows where the September light was streaming in. "Dad," she said, still laughing, "you're a mess." "I'm a professor." "Can you be both?" "Apparently." They walked out of the Simons building together, the 3 of them, into a September afternoon that was warm and bright and smelled like cut grass and the faint exhaust of a campus shuttle idling at the curb. Chloe walked between Ethan and Vanessa, holding her father's hand and swinging Professor Beans with the other arm, chattering about whether the cafeteria had pizza and whether she could sit in on another class sometime and whether the graduate student she'd met liked rabbits or was just being polite. Vanessa walked with her hands in her pockets, her shoulder close to Ethan's but not touching, the space between them electric with things unsaid. She listened to Chloe's monologue with an attention that was careful and genuine and slightly overwhelmed, the way someone listens when they are learning a language they didn't grow up speaking. Ethan walked between his daughter and the woman who had changed his life, first by nearly destroying it, then by fighting to rebuild it. And he felt the weight in his chest shift one final time. Not gone. It would never be gone. Grief doesn't disappear. It doesn't resolve like an equation or heal like a wound. It becomes part of the structure, load-bearing, permanent, integral to the shape of whatever you build on top of it. Sarah was in that weight. She would always be in it. And Chloe was in his hand, warm and alive and chattering about pizza. And Vanessa was beside him, walking in step, not quite touching, not quite apart. And the campus spread out before them, brick and glass and old trees with new leaves. And somewhere in a building behind them, a whiteboard was covered in his handwriting. And somewhere ahead of them was a future he couldn't see the shape of yet, but was no longer afraid to walk toward. Chloe pulled at his hand. Dad? Yeah? Can I ask you something? Always. She looked up at him with those brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, always Sarah's, and her face was serious in the way it got when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. Is my dad really the smartest person here? The question was directed at Vanessa. Chloe had turned her head to look at the woman walking on her other side, and her expression was not challenging or skeptical, but genuinely curious. The way children are curious when they're testing a theory they've already formed but want confirmed by an outside source. Vanessa stopped walking. She looked down at Chloe, and then she looked at Ethan, and something passed between the two adults that was too complicated for a 9-year-old to read, but that she felt anyway, the way children feel things. Instinctively, completely, without needing words. No, Vanessa said, and her voice was quiet but steady. He's the smartest man I've ever known. Chloe considered this. She looked at her father, she looked at Vanessa, she looked at Professor Beans as if consulting him on the matter. Okay, she said, can we get pizza now? They got pizza, not from Sal's on Carpenter Street, that was too far, but from a place near campus that Chloe approved of after conducting a rigorous evaluation of the menu that involved asking the cashier 3 questions about pepperoni sourcing. They sat at a table by the window, the 3 of them, and Chloe ate 2 slices and Ethan ate 3 and Vanessa ate 1.5 because she was still the kind of person who ate carefully in public, though less carefully than she used to be. And Ethan, sitting in a pizza restaurant on a September afternoon with marker on his forehead and grease on his fingers, and his daughter laughing beside him, and a woman across the table who was learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be something other than alone. Ethan finally understood the thing that the last 5 years had been trying to teach him. It wasn't that talent saves you. Talent doesn't save anyone. Talent is a tool, like a mop or a marker or a cheap spiral notebook. What you do with it depends on something else, on whether, when the world knocks you to the floor and steps over you and turns off the lights, you can find a reason to stand up again, and that reason is never abstract. It's never a principle or an idea or a dream of future success. It's always specific. It's always a person, a small hand reaching for yours, a voice in the dark saying, "Dad, I can't breathe." A woman sitting across a table with pizza sauce on her thumb, looking at you with an expression that says, "I see you, all of you, and I'm not looking away." Ethan had spent 4 years being invisible. He'd cleaned floors and paid bills and carried grief and raised a daughter and written mathematics in the margins of a life that had no room for it. And he'd done all of it alone because alone was the only way he knew how to survive. And then a woman in a charcoal blazer had laughed at him in a classroom, and the world had cracked open. And what poured through the crack wasn't light or hope or any of the other pretty words people use when they talk about redemption. What poured through was something messier and harder and more honest than that. It was the truth. The uncomfortable, unglamorous, complicated truth that no one makes it alone. that asking for help isn't weakness, that being seen, truly seen, with all your damage and all your brilliance and all the parts of yourself you've been hiding, is the most terrifying and necessary thing a human being can do. Chloe finished her pizza and leaned against Ethan's arm, drowsy from food and warmth. Professor Bean sat on the table between the napkin dispenser and the Parmesan shaker, his button eyes staring at the ceiling with the serene indifference of a stuffed rabbit who has seen everything and judged nothing. Vanessa reached across the table and picked up a napkin. She wiped the marker off Ethan's forehead, a small, practical gesture that was also the most intimate thing she'd ever done in front of another person. Her hand was steady. His breathing was not. "You still had blue on your face," she said. "Thanks." "You're welcome." Chloe, without opening her eyes, said, "You guys are weird." And Ethan laughed, not the careful, measured laugh of a man managing his emotions. A real laugh, full and unguarded and slightly too loud for a pizza restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of laugh that comes from a place you thought was empty and turns out to be full. Full of all the things you thought you'd lost, and all the things you didn't know you were building, and all the small, ordinary, extraordinary moments that make up a life. His story was never over. It had just been waiting for him to pick up the pen.